Chapter 37. Midnight came and passed silently, for there was nothing to announce it in the valley of the Froom. Not long after 1 o'clock there was a slight creak in the darkened farmhouse, once the mansion of the d'Urbervilles. Tess, who used the upper chamber, heard it and awoke. It had come from the corner step of the staircase, which, as usual, was loosely nailed. She saw the door of her bedroom open, and the figure of her husband across the stream of moonlight with a curiously careful tread. He was in his shirt and trousers only, and her first flush of joy died when she perceived that his eyes were fixed in an unnatural stare on vacancy. When he reached the middle of the room he stood still and murmured, in tones of indescribable sadness, "Dead, dead, dead." Under the influence of any strong disturbing force, Clare would occasionally walk in his sleep, and even perform strange acts, such as he had done on the night of their return from market just before their marriage, when he reenacted in his bedroom his combat with the man who had insulted her. Tess saw that continued mental distress had wrought him into that somnambulistic state now. Her loyal confidence in him lay so deep down in her heart that, awake or asleep, he inspired her with no sort of personal fear. If he had entered with a pistol in his hand, he would have scarcely disturbed her trust in his protectiveness. Clare came close and bent over her. "Dead, dead, dead," he murmured. After fixedly regarding her for some moments with the same gaze of unmeasurable woe, he bent lower, enclosed her in his arms, and rolled her on the sheet as in a shroud. Then, lifting her up from the bed with as much respect as one would show to a dead body, he carried her across the room, murmuring, "My poor Tess, my dearest darling Tess, so sweet, so good, so true." The words of endearment, withheld so severely in his waking hours, were inexpressibly sweet to her forlorn and hungry heart. If it had been to save her weary life, she would not, by moving or struggling, have put an end to the position she found herself in. Thus she lay in absolute stillness, scarcely venturing to breathe, and, wondering what he was going to do with her, suffered herself to be borne out upon the landing. "My wife, dead, dead," he said. He paused in his labours for a moment to lean with her against the banister. Was he going to throw her down? Self-solicitude was near extinction in her heart, and in the knowledge that he had planned to depart on the morrow, possibly for always, she lay in his arms in this precarious position with a sense rather of luxury than of terror. If they could only fall together, and both be dashed to pieces, how fit, how desirable! However, he did not let her fall, but took advantage of the support of the handrail to imprint a kiss upon her lips in the daytime scorned. Yet he clasped her with a renewed firmness of hold, and descended the staircase. The creak of the loose stair did not awaken him, and they reached the ground floor safely. Freeing one of his hands from his grasp of her for a moment, he slid back the door bar and passed out, slightly striking his stockinged toe against the edge of the door. But this he seemed not to mind, and, having room for extension in the open air, he lifted her against his shoulder that he could carry her with ease, the absence of clothes taking much from his burden. Thus he bore her off the premises in the direction of the river a few yards distant. His ultimate intention, if he had any, she had not yet divined, and she found herself conjecturing on the matter as a third person might have done. So easily had she delivered her whole being up to him that it pleased her to think he was regarding her as his absolute possession, to dispose of as he should choose. It was consoling, under the hovering terror of tomorrow's separation, to feel that he really recognized her now as his wife Tess, and did not cast her off, even if in that recognition he went so far as to aggregate to himself the right of harming her. Ah, now she knew what he was dreaming of. That Sunday morning, when he had borne her along through the water with the other dairymaids who had loved him nearly as much as she, if that were possible, which Tess could hardly admit. Clare did not cross the bridge with her, but proceeding several paces on the same side towards the adjoining mill, at length stood still on the brink of the river. Its rivers, in creeping down these miles of meadowland, frequently divided, serpentining in purposeless curves, looping themselves around little islands that had no name, returning and re-embodying themselves as a broad main stream further on. Opposite the spot to which he had brought her was such a general confluence, and the river was proportionately voluminous and deep. Across it was a narrow footbridge, but now the autumn flood had washed the handrail away, leaving the bare plank only, which, lying a few inches above the speeding current, formed a giddy pathway for even steady heads. And Tess had noticed from the window of the house in the daytime young men walking across it as a feat in balancing. Her husband had possibly observed the same performance. Anyhow, he now mounted the plank, and sliding one foot forward, advanced along it. Was he going to drown her? Probably he was. The spot was lonely, the river deep and wide enough to make such a purpose easy of accomplishment. He might drown her if he would. It would be better than parting tomorrow to lead severed lives. The swift stream raced and gyrated under them, tossing, distorting, and splitting the moon's reflected face. Spots of froth travelled past, and intercepted weeds waved behind the piles. If they could both fall together into the current now, their arms would be so tightly clasped together that they could not be saved. They would go out of the world almost painlessly, and there would be no more reproach for her, or to him for marrying her. His last half hour with her would have been a loving one, while if they lived till he awoke his daytime aversion would return, and this hour would remain to be contemplated only as a transient dream. The impulse stirred in her, yet she dared not indulge it, to make a movement that would have precipitated them both into the gulf. How she valued her own life had been proved, but his, she had no right to tamper with it. He reached the other side with her in safety. Here they were within a plantation which formed the abbey grounds, and, taking a new hold of her, he went onwards a few steps till they had reached the ruined choir of the abbey church. Against the north wall was the empty stone coffin of an abbot, in which every tourist with a turn for grim humour was accustomed to stretch himself. In this Clare carefully laid Tess. Having kissed her lips a second time, he breathed deeply, as if a greatly desired end were attained. Clare then lay down on the ground alongside, when he immediately fell into a deep dead slumber of exhaustion, and remained motionless as a log. The spurt of mental excitement which had produced the effort was now over. Tess sat up in the coffin. The night, though dry and mild for the season, was more than sufficiently cold to make it dangerous for him to remain here long in his half-clothed state. If he were left to himself, he would, in all probability, stay there till the morning, and be chilled to certain death. She had heard of such deaths after sleepwalking. But how could she dare to awaken him and let him know what he had been doing, when it would mortify him to discover his folly in respect of her? Tess, however, stepping out of her stone confine, shook him slightly, and was unable to arouse him without being violent. It was indispensable to do something, for she was beginning to shiver, the sheet being but a poor protection. Her excitement had in a measure kept her warm during the few minutes' adventure, but that beatific interval was over. It suddenly occurred to her to try persuasion, and accordingly she whispered in his ear with as much firmness and decision as she could summon, "Let us walk on, darling," at the same time taking him suggestively by the arm. To her relief he unresistingly acquiesced. Her words had apparently thrown him back into his dream, which henceforward seemed to enter into a new phase, wherein he fancied she had risen as a spirit, and was leading him to heaven. Thus she conducted him by the arm to the stone bridge in front of their residence, crossing which they stood at the manor house door. Tess's feet were quite bare, and the stones hurt her and chilled her to the bone. But Clare was in his woollen stockings, and appeared to feel no discomfort. There was no further difficulty. She induced him to lie down on his own sofa bed, and covered him up warmly, lighting a temporary fire of wood to dry any dampness out of him. The noise of these attentions, she thought, might awaken him, and secretly wished that they might. But the exhaustion of his mind and his body was such that he remained undisturbed. As soon as they met the next morning, Tess divined that Angel knew little or nothing of how far she had been concerned in the night's excursion, though, as regarded himself, he may have been aware that he had not lain still. In truth, he had awakened that morning from a sleep deep as annihilation, and during those first few moments in which the brain, like a Samson shaking himself, is trying its strength, he had some dim notion of an unusual nocturnal proceeding. But the realities of his situation soon displaced conjecture on the other subject. He waited in expectancy to discern some mental pointing. He knew that if any intention of his, concluded overnight, did not vanish in the light of morning, it stood on a basis approximating to one of pure reason, even if initiated by impulse of feeling, that it was so far, therefore, to be trusted. He thus beheld in the pale morning light the resolve to separate from her, not as a hot and indignant instinct, but denuded of the passionateness which had made it scorch and burn. Standing in its bones, nothing but a skeleton, but none the less there. Clare no longer hesitated. At breakfast, and while they were packing the few remaining articles, he showed his weariness from the night's effort so unmistakably that Tess was on the point of revealing all that had happened. But the reflection that it would anger him, grieve him, stultify him, to know that he had instinctively manifested a fondness for her of which his common sense did not approve, that his inclination had compromised his dignity when reason slept, again deterred her. It was too much like laughing at a man when sober for his erratic deeds during intoxication. It just crossed her mind, too, that he might have a faint recollection of his tender vagary, and was disinclined to allude to it from a conviction that she would take amatory advantage of the opportunity it gave her of appealing to him anew not to go. He had ordered by letter a vehicle from the nearest town, and soon after breakfast it arrived. She saw in it the beginning of the end, the temporary end, at least, for the revelation of his tenderness by the incident of the night raised dreams of a possible future with him. The luggage was put on the top, and the man drove off, the miller and the old waiting woman expressing some surprise at their precipitate departure, which Clare attributed to his discovery that the millwork was not of the modern kind which he wished to investigate, a statement that was true so far as it went. Beyond this there was nothing in the manner of their leaving to suggest a fiasco, or that they were not going together to visit friends. Their route lay near the dairy farm from which they had started with such solemn joy in each other a few days back, and as Clare wished to wind up his business with Mr. Crick, Tess could hardly avoid paying Mrs. Crick a call at the same time, unless she would excite suspicion in their unhappy state. To make the call as unobtrusive as possible, they left the cottage by the wicket leading down from the high road to the dairy house, and descended the track on foot, side by side. The withy bed had been cut, and they could see over the stumps the spot to which Clare had followed her when he pressed her to be his wife, to the left the enclosure in which she had been fascinated by his harp, and far away, behind the cow stalls, the mead which had been the scene of their first embrace. The gold of the summer picture was now grey, the colours mean, the rich soil mud, and the river cold. Over the Barton gate the dairyman saw them, and came forward, throwing into his face the kind of jocularity deemed appropriate in Talbothays and its vicinity on the appearance of the newly married. Then Mrs. Crick emerged from the house, and several others of their old acquaintance, though Marian and Retty did not seem to be there. Tess valiantly bore their sly attacks and friendly humours, which affected her far otherwise than they supposed. In the tacit agreement of husband and wife to keep their estrangement a secret, they behaved as would have been ordinary, and then, although she would rather there had been no word spoken on the subject, Tess had to hear in detail the story of Marian and Retty. The latter had gone home to her father's, and Marian was left to look for employment elsewhere. They feared that she would come to no good. To dissipate the sadness of this recital, Tess went and bade all her favourite cows good-bye, touching each of them with her hand, and she and Clare stood side by side at leaving, as if united body and soul. There would have been something peculiarly sorry in their aspect to one who should have seen it truly. Two limbs of one life as they outwardly were, his arm touching hers, her skirts touching him, facing one way as against all the dairy facing the other, speaking their adieu as we, and yet sundered like the poles. Perhaps something unusually stiff and embarrassed in their attitude, some awkwardness in acting up to their profession of unity, different from the natural shyness in young couples, may have been apparent, for when they were gone Mrs. Crick said to her husband, "How unnatural the brightness of her eyes did seem, and how they stood like waxen images and talked as if they were in a dream. Didn't it strike ye as 'twas so? Tess had always summat strange in her, and she's not now quite the proud young bride of a well-be-doing man." They re-entered the vehicle, and were driven along the roads towards Weatherbury and Stagfoot Lane, till they reached the Lane Inn, where Clare dismissed the fly and the man. They rested here a while, and entering the Vale, were next driven onward towards her home by a stranger who did not know their relations. At a midway point, when Nuttlebury had been passed, and where there were cross-roads, Clare stopped the conveyance, and said to Tess that if she meant to return to her mother's house, it was here that he would leave her. As they could not talk with freedom in the driver's presence, he asked her to accompany him for a few steps on foot along one of the branch roads. She assented, and directing the man to wait a few minutes, they strolled away. "Now let us understand each other," he said gently. "There is no anger between us, though there is that which I cannot endure at present. I will try to bring myself to endure it. I will let you know where I go as soon as I know myself, and if I can bring myself to bear it, if it is desirable, possible, I will come to you. But until I come to you, it would be better that you would not try to come to me." The severity of the decree seemed deadly to Tess. She saw his view of her clearly enough. He could regard her in no other light than that of one who had practised gross deceit upon him. Yet could a woman who had done even what she had done deserve all this? But she could contest the point with him no further. She simply repeated after him his own words. "Until you come to me, I must not try to come to you?" "Just so." "May I write to you?" "Oh yes, if you are ill or want anything at all. I hope that it will not be the case, so that it may happen that I write to you first." "I agree to the conditions, Angel, because you know best what my punishment ought to be. Only, don't make it more than I can bear." This was all she said on the matter. If Tess had been artful, had she made a scene, fainted, wept hysterically in that lonely lane, notwithstanding the fury of fastidiousness with which he was possessed, he would probably not have withstood her. But her mood of long suffering made his way easy for him, and she herself was his best advocate. Pride so entered into her submission, which perhaps was a symptom of that reckless acquiescence in chance so apparent in the whole d'Urberville family, and the many effective chords which she could have stirred by an appeal were left untouched. The remainder of their discourse was on practical matters only. He now handed her a packet containing a fairly good sum of money which he had obtained from his bankers on the purpose. The brilliance, the interest in which seemed to be Tess's for her life only, if he understood the wording of the will, he advised her to let him send to a bank for safety, and to this she readily agreed. These things arranged, he walked with Tess back to the carriage and handed her in. The coachman was paid and told where to drive her. Taking next his own bag and umbrella, the sole articles he had brought with him hitherwards, he bade her good-bye, and they parted there and then. The fly moved creepingly up a hill, and Clare watched it go with an unpremeditated hope that Tess would look out of the window for one moment. But that she never thought of doing, would not have ventured to do, lying in a half-dead faint inside. Thus he beheld her recede, and in the anguish of his heart quoted a line from a poet, with particular emendations of his own. "God's not in his heaven, all's wrong with the world." When Tess had passed over the crest of the hill, he turned to go his own way, and hardly knew that he loved her still. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38. As she drove on through Blackmore Vale, and the landscape of her youth began to open around her, Tess aroused herself from her stupor. Her first thought was, how would she be able to face her parents? She reached a turnpike gate which stood upon the highway to the village. It was thrown open by a stranger, not by the old man who had kept it for many years, and to whom she had been known. He had probably left on New Year's Day, the date when such changes were made. Having received no intelligence lately from her home, she asked the turnpike keeper for news. "Oh, nothing, miss," he answered. "Marlott is Marlott still. Folks have died and that. John Durbeyfield, too, have a daughter married this week to a gentleman farmer. Not from John's own house, you know. They was married elsewhere, the gentleman being of that high standard that John's own folk was not considered well be-doing enough to have any part in it. The bridegroom seeming not to know how to have been discovered that John is a old and ancient nobleman himself by blood, with family skillingtons in their own vaults to this day.
but done out of his property in the time of the Romans. However, Sir John, as we call him now, kept up the wedding day as well as he could, and stood treat to everybody in the parish, and John's wife sung songs at the pure dewdrop till past 11 at night."
Hearing this, Tess felt so sick at heart that she could not decide to go home publicly in the fly with her luggage and belongings. She asked the turnpike keeper if she might deposit her things at his house for a while, and on his offering no objection, she dismissed her carriage and went on to the village alone by a back lane. At sight of her father's chimney, she asked herself how she could possibly enter the house. Inside that cottage her relations were calmly supposing her far away on a wedding tour with a comparatively rich man, who was to conduct her to bouncing prosperity, while here she was, friendless, creeping up to the old door quite by herself, with no better place to go to in the world. She did not reach the house unobserved. Just by the garden hedge she was met by a girl who knew her, one of the 2 or 3 with whom she had been intimate at school. After making a few inquiries as to how Tess came there, her friend, unheeding her tragic look, interrupted with, "But where's thy gentleman, Tess?" Tess hastily explained that he had been called away on business, and leaving her interlocutor clambered over the garden hedge and thus made her way to the house. As she went up the garden path she heard her mother singing by the back door, coming in sight of which she perceived Mrs. Durbeyfield on the doorstep in the act of wringing a sheet. Having performed this without observing Tess, she went indoors, and her daughter followed her. The washing tub stood in the same old place on the same old quarter hogshead, and her mother, having thrown the sheet aside, was about to plunge her arms in anew. "Why, Tess, my child, I thought you was married really and truly by this time. We sent the cider." "Yes, mother, so I am." "Going to be?" "No, I am married." "Married? Then where's thy husband?" "Oh, he's gone away for a time." "Gone away? When was you married then? The day you said?" "Yes, Tuesday, mother." "And now 'tis only Saturday, and he's gone away?" "Yes, he's gone." "What's the meaning of that? Nation see such husbands as you seem to get, say I." "Mother!" Tess went across to Joan Durbeyfield, laid her face upon the matron's bosom, and burst into sobs. "I don't know how to tell 'ee, mother. You said to me and wrote to me that I was not to tell him, but I did tell him. I couldn't help it, and he went away." "Oh, you little fool, you little fool!" burst out Mrs. Durbeyfield, splashing Tess and herself in her agitation. "My good God, that ever I should have lived to say it! But I say it again, you little fool!" Tess was convulsed with weeping, the tension of so many days having relaxed at last. "I know it, I know," she gasped through her sobs. "But, oh, my mother, I could not help it. He was so good, and I felt the wickedness of trying to blind him as to what had happened. If it were to be done again, I should do the same. I could not, I dared not so sin against him." "But you sinned enough to marry him first." Yes, that's where my misery do lie. But I thought he could get rid of me by law if it were determined not to overlook it. And oh, if you could only half know how I loved him, how anxious I was to have him, and how wrong I was between caring so much for him and my wish to be fair to him." Tess was so shaken that she could get no further, and sank, a helpless thing, into a chair. Well, what's done cannot be undone. I'm sure I don't know why children of my bringing should all be bigger simpletons than other people's.
Not to know better than to blab such a thing as that, when he couldn't have found out till too late."
Here Mrs. Durbeyfield began shedding tears on her own account as a mother to be pitied.
"What your father will say I don't know," she continued, "and he's been talking about the wedding up at Rolliver's and the Pure Drop every day since, and about his family getting back to their rightful position through you, poor silly man, and now you've made this mess of it. The Lord.
And as if to bring matters to a focus, Tess's father was heard approaching at that moment. He did not, however, enter immediately, and Mrs. Durbeyfield said that she would break the bad news to him herself, Tess keeping out of sight for the present. After her first burst of disappointment, Joan began to take the mishap as she had taken Tess's original trouble, as she would have taken a wet holiday or failure in the potato crop, as a thing which had come upon them irrespective of desert or folly, a chance external impingement to be borne with, not a lesson. Tess retreated upstairs and beheld casually that the beds had been shifted and new arrangements made. Her old bed had been adapted for 2 younger children. There was no place here for her now. The room below being unceilinged, she could hear most of what went on there. Presently her father entered, apparently carrying a live hen. He was a foot haggler now, having been obliged to sell his second horse, and he travelled with his basket on his arm. The hen had been carried about this morning, as it was often carried, to show people that he was in his work, though it had lain, with its legs tied, under the table at Rolliver's for more than an hour.
"We've just read up a story about," Durbeyfield began, and thereupon related in detail to his wife a discussion which had arisen at the inn about the clergy, originated by the fact of his daughter having married into a clerical family. "They was formerly styled Sir, like my own ancestry," he said, "though nowadays their true style, strictly speaking, is Clark only." As Tess had wished that no great publicity should be given to the event, he had mentioned no particulars. He hoped she would remove that prohibition soon. He proposed that the couple should take Tess's own name, d'Urberville, as uncorrupted. It was better than her husband's. He asked if any letter had come from her that day. Then Mrs. Durbeyfield informed him that no letter had come, but Tess, unfortunately, had come herself. When at length the collapse was explained to him, a sullen mortification, not unusual with Durbeyfield, overpowered the influence of the cheering glass. Yet the intrinsic quality of the event moved his touchy sensitiveness less than its conjectured effect upon the minds of others. "To think now that this was to be the end on't," said Sir John, "and I with a family vault under that there church of Kingsbere as big as Squire Jolland's ale cellar, and my folk lying there in 6s and 7s as genuine county bones and marrow as any recorded in history. And now to be sure what they fellows at Rolliver's and the Pure Drop will say to me, how they'll squint and glane and say, 'This is your mighty match, is it? This is your getting back to the true level of your forefathers in King Norman's time.' I feel this is too much, Joan. I shall put an end to myself, title and all. I can bear it no longer." "But can she make him keep her if he's married her?" "Why, yes, but she won't think of doing that." "Do ye think he really have married her, or is it like the first?" Poor Tess, who had heard as far as this, could not bear to hear any more. The perception that her word could be doubted even here, in her own parental house, set her mind against the spot as nothing else could have done. How unexpected were the attacks of destiny! And if her father doubted her a little, would not neighbours and acquaintance doubt her much? Oh, she could not live long at home. A few days accordingly were all that she allowed herself here.
at the end of which time she received a short note from Clare informing her that he had gone to the north of England to look at a farm. In her craving for the lustre of her true position as his wife, and to hide from her parents the vast extent of the division between them, she made use of this letter as her reason for again departing, leaving them under the impression that she was setting out to join him. Still further to screen her husband from any imputation of unkindness to her, she took 25 of the £50 Clare had given her, and handed the sum over to her mother, as if the wife of a man like Angel Clare could well afford it, saying that it was a slight return for the trouble and humiliation she had brought upon them in years past. With this assertion of her dignity she bade them farewell, and after that there were lively doings in the Durbeyfield household for some time on the strength of Tess's bounty, her mother saying, and indeed believing, that the rupture which had arisen between the young husband and wife had adjusted itself under their strong feeling that they could not live apart from each other. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39. It was 3 weeks after the marriage that Clare found himself descending the hill which led to the well-known parsonage of his father. With his downward course the tower of the church rose into the evening sky in a manner of inquiry as to why he had come, and no living person in the twilighted town seemed to notice him, still less to expect him. He was arriving like a ghost, and the sound of his own footsteps was almost an encumbrance to be got rid of. The picture of life had changed for him. Before this time he had known it but speculatively. Now he thought he knew it as a practical man, though perhaps he did not even yet. Nevertheless, humanity stood before him no longer in the pensive sweetness of Italian art, but in the staring and ghastly attitudes of a Wiertz museum, and with the leer of a study by Van Beers. His conduct during these first weeks had been desultory beyond description. After mechanically attempting to pursue his agricultural plans as though nothing unusual had happened, in the manner recommended by the great and wise men of all ages, he concluded that very few of those great and wise men had ever gone so far outside themselves as to test the feasibility of their counsel. "This is the chief thing. Be not perturbed," said the pagan moralist. That was just Clare's own opinion, but he was perturbed. "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid," said the Nazarene. Clare chimed in cordially, but his heart was troubled all the same. How he would have liked to confront these two great thinkers, and earnestly appeal to them as fellow man to fellow men, and ask them to tell him their method. His mood transmuted itself into a dogged indifference, till at length he fancied he was looking on his own existence with the passive interest of an outsider. He was embittered by the conviction that all this desolation had been brought about by the accident of her being a d'Urberville. When he found that Tess came of that exhausted ancient line, and was not of the new tribes from below, as he had fondly dreamed, why had he not stoically abandoned her in fidelity to his principles? This was what he had got by apostasy, and his punishment was deserved. Then he became weary and anxious, and his anxiety increased. He wondered if he had treated her unfairly. He ate without knowing that he ate, and drank without tasting. As the hours dropped past, as the motive of each act in the long series of bygone days presented itself to his view, he perceived how intimately the notion of having Tess as a dear possession was mixed up with all his schemes and words and ways. In going hither and thither, he observed in the outskirts of a small town a red and blue placard setting forth the great advances of the Empire of Brazil as a field for the emigrating agriculturalist. Land was offered there at exceptionally advantageous terms. Brazil somewhat attracted him as a new idea. Tess could eventually join him there, and perhaps in that country of contrasting scenes and notions and habits the conventions would not be so operative which made life with her seem impractical to him here. In brief, he was strongly inclined to try Brazil, especially as the season for going thither was just at hand. With this view he was returning to Emminster to disclose his plan to his parents, and to make the best explanation he could make of arriving without Tess, short of revealing what had actually separated them. As he reached the door the new moon shone upon his face, just as the old one had done in the small hours of that morning when he had carried his wife in his arms across the river to the graveyard of the monks, but his face was thinner now. Clare had given his parents no warning of his visit, and his arrival stirred the atmosphere of the vicarage as the dive of a kingfisher stirs a quiet pool. His father and mother were both in the drawing-room, but neither of his brothers was now at home. Angel entered and closed the door quietly behind him. "But where's your wife, dear Angel?" cried his mother. "How you surprise us!" "She is at her mother's temporarily. I have come home rather in a hurry, because I've decided to go to Brazil." "Brazil? Why, they are all Roman Catholics there, surely." "Are they? I hadn't thought of that." But even the novelty and painfulness of his going into a papistical land could not displace for long Mr. and Mrs. Clare's natural interest in their son's marriage. "We had your brief note 3 weeks ago announcing that it had taken place," said Mrs. Clare, "and your father sent your godmother's gift to her, as you know. Of course it was best that none of us should be present, especially as you preferred to marry her from the dairy and not at her home, wherever that may be. It would have embarrassed you and given us no pleasure. Your brothers felt that very strongly. Now it's done, we do not complain, particularly if she suits you for the business you have chosen to follow instead of the ministry of the gospel. Yet I wish I could have seen her first, Angel, or have known a little more about her. We sent her no present of our own, not knowing what would be best to give her pleasure. But you must suppose it only delayed. Angel, there is no irritation in my mind or your father's against you for this marriage, but we have thought it much better to reserve our liking for your wife till we could see her. And now you have not brought her. It seems strange. What has happened?" He replied that it had been thought best by them that she should go to her parents' home for the present, whilst he came there. "I don't mind telling you, dear mother," he said, "that I always meant to keep her away from this house till I should feel she could come with credit to you. But this idea of Brazil is quite a recent one. If I do go, it will be unadvisable for me to take her on this, my first journey. She will remain at her mother's till I come back." "And I shall not see her before you start?" He was afraid they would not. His original plan had been, as he had said, to refrain from bringing her there for some little while, not to wound their prejudices, feelings, in any way, and for other reasons he had adhered to it. He would have to visit home in the course of a year if he went out at once, and it would be possible for them to see her before he started a second time, with her. A hastily prepared supper was brought in, and Clare made further exposition of his plans. His mother's disappointment at not seeing the bride still remained with her. Clare's late enthusiasm for Tess had infected her through her maternal sympathies, till she had almost fancied that a good thing could come out of Nazareth, a charming woman out of Talbothays dairy. She watched her son as he ate. "Cannot you describe her? I'm sure she's very pretty, Angel." "Of that there can be no question," he said with a zest that covered its bitterness. "And that she is pure and virtuous goes without question?" "Pure and virtuous, of course she is." "I can see her quite distinctly. You said the other day she was fine in figure, roundly built, and had deep red lips like Cupid's bow, dark eyelashes and brows, an immense rope of hair like a ship's cable, and large eyes, violety bluey blackish." "I did, mother." "I quite see her. And living in such seclusion, she naturally had scarce ever seen any young man from the world without till she saw you." "Scarcely." "You were her first love?" "Of course." "There are worse wives than these simple, rosy-mouthed, robust girls of the farm. Certainly I could have wished—well, since my son is to be an agriculturalist, it is perhaps but proper that his wife should have been accustomed to an outdoor life." His father was less inquisitive, but when the time came for the chapter from the Bible, which was always read before evening prayers, the vicar observed to Mrs. Clare, "I think, since Angel has come, that it will be more appropriate to read the 31st of Proverbs than the chapter we should have had in the usual course of our reading." "Yes, certainly," said Mrs. Clare. "The words of King Lemuel." She could cite chapter and verse as well as her husband. "My dear son, your father has decided to read us the chapter in Proverbs in praise of a virtuous wife. We shall not need to be reminded to apply the words to the absent one. May heaven shield her in all her ways." A lump rose in Clare's throat. The portable lectern was taken out from the corner and set in the middle of the fireplace. The two old servants came in, and Angel's father began to read at the 10th verse of the aforesaid chapter. "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. She riseth while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excelleth them all." When prayers were over, his mother said, "I could not help thinking how very aptly that chapter your dear father read applied in some of its particulars to the woman you have chosen. The perfect woman, you see, was a working woman, not an idler, not a fine lady, but one who used her hands and her head and her heart for the good of others. Her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but she excelleth them all." Well, I wish I could have seen her, Angel. Since she is pure and chaste, she would have been refined enough for me. Clare could bear this no longer. His eyes were full of tears which seemed like drops of molten lead. He bade a quick good night to the sincere and simple souls whom he loved so well, who knew neither the world, the flesh, nor the devil in their own hearts, only as something vague and external to themselves. He went to his own chamber. His mother followed him and tapped at his door. Clare opened it to discover her standing without with anxious eyes. "Angel," she asked, "is there something wrong that you go away so soon? I'm sure you're not yourself." "I am not quite, mother," said he. "About her? Now, my son, I know it is that. I know it is about her. Have you quarrelled in these 3 weeks?" "We have not exactly quarrelled," he said, "but we have had a difference." "Angel, is she a young woman whose history will bear investigation?" With a mother's instinct, Mrs. Clare had put her finger on the kind of trouble that would cause such a disquiet as seemed to agitate her son. "She is spotless," he replied, and felt that if it had sent him to eternal hell, there and then he would have told that lie. "Then never mind the rest. After all, there are few purer things in nature than an unsullied country maid. Any crudeness of manner which may offend your more educated sense at first will, I am sure, disappear under the influence of your companionship and tuition." Such terrible sarcasm of blind magnanimity brought home to Clare the secondary perception that he had utterly wrecked his career by this marriage, which had not been among his early thoughts after the disclosure. True, on his own account he cared very little about his career, but he had wished to make it at least a respectable one on account of his parents and brothers. And now, as he looked into the candle, its flame dumbly expressed to him that it was made to shine on sensible people, and that it abhorred lighting the face of a dupe and a failure. When his agitation had cooled, he would be at moments incensed with his poor wife for causing a situation in which he was obliged to practice deception on his parents. He almost talked to her in his anger as if she had been in the room, and then her cooing voice, plaintive in expostulation, disturbed the darkness. The velvet touch of her lips passed over his brow, and he could distinguish in the air the warmth of her breath. This night the woman of his belittling deprecations was thinking how great and good her husband was, but over them both there hung a deeper shade than the shade which Angel Clare perceived, namely, the shade of his own limitations. With all his attempted independence of judgment, this advanced and well-meaning young man, a sample product of the last 25 years, was yet the slave to custom and conventionality when surprised back into his early teachings. No prophet had told him, and he was not prophet enough to tell himself, that essentially this young wife of his was as deserving of the praise of King Lemuel as any other woman endowed with the same dislike of evil, her moral value having to be reckoned not by achievement but by tendency. Moreover, the figure near at hand suffers on such occasions because it shows up its sorriness without shade, while vague figures afar off are honoured, in that their distance makes artistic virtues of their stains. In considering what Tess was not, he overlooked what she was, and forgot that the defective can be more than the entire. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40. At breakfast Brazil was the topic, and all endeavoured to take a hopeful view of Clare's proposed experiment with that country's soil, notwithstanding the discouraging reports of some farm labourers who had immigrated thither and returned home within the 12 months. After breakfast Clare went into the little town to wind up such trifling matters as he was concerned with there, and to get from the local bank all the money he possessed. On his way back he encountered Miss Mercy Chant by the church, from whose walls she seemed to be a sort of emanation. She was carrying an armful of Bibles for her class, and such was her view of life that events which produced heartaches in others wrought beatific smiles upon her. An enviable result, although in the opinion of Angel it was obtained by a curiously unnatural sacrifice of humanity to mysticism. She had learnt that he was about to leave England, and observed what an excellent and promising scheme it seemed to be. "Yes, it is a likely scheme enough in a commercial sense, no doubt," he replied. "But, my dear Mercy, it snaps the continuity of existence. Perhaps a cloister would be preferable." "A cloister? Oh, Angel Clare!" "Well?" "Why, you wicked man, a cloister implies a monk. and a monk Roman Catholicism, and Roman Catholicism sin, and sin damnation. Thou art in a parlous state, Angel Clare." "I glory in my Protestantism," she said severely. Then Clare, thrown by sheer misery into one of the demoniacal moods in which a man does despite to his true principles, called her close to him and fiendishly whispered in her ear the most heterodox ideas he could think of. His momentary laughter at the horror which appeared on her fair face ceased when it merged in pain and anxiety for his welfare. "Dear Mercy," he said, "you must forgive me. I think I am going crazy." She thought that he was, and thus the interview ended, and Clare re-entered the vicarage. With the local banker he deposited the jewels till happier days should arise. He also paid into the bank £30 to be sent to Tess in a few months, as she might require, and wrote to her at her parents' home in Blackmore Vale to inform her of what he had done. This amount, with the sum he had already placed in her hands, about £50, he hoped would be amply sufficient for her wants just at present, particularly as in an emergency she had been directed to apply to his father. He deemed it best not to put his parents into communication with her by informing them of her address, and being unaware of what had really happened to estrange the two, neither his father nor his mother suggested he should do so. During the day he left the parsonage, for what he had to complete he wished to get done quickly. As the last duty before leaving this part of England, it was necessary for him to call at the Wellbridge farmhouse, in which he had spent with Tess the first 3 days of their marriage, the trifle of rent having to be paid, the key given up of the rooms they had occupied, and 2 or 3 small articles fetched away that they had left behind. It was under this roof that the deepest shadow ever thrown upon his life had stretched its gloom over him. Yet when he unlocked the door of the sitting-room and looked into it, the memory which returned first upon him was that of their happy arrival on a similar afternoon, the fresh sense of sharing a habitation conjointly, the first meal together, the chatting by the fire with joined hands. The farmer and his wife were in the fields at the moment of his visit, and Clare was in the rooms alone for some time. Inwardly swollen with a renewal of sentiments that he had not quite reckoned with, he went upstairs to her chamber, which had never been his. The bed was smooth as she had made it with her own hands on the morning of leaving. The mistletoe hung under the tester just as he had placed it. Having been there 3 or 4 weeks, it was turning colour. The leaves and berries were wrinkled. Angel took it down and crushed it into the grate. Standing there, he, for the first time, doubted whether his course in this conjuncture had been a wise, much less a generous one. But had he not been cruelly blinded? In the incoherent multitude of his emotions he knelt down at the bedside, wet-eyed. "Oh, Tess, if you had only told me sooner, I would have forgiven you," he mourned. Hearing a footstep below, he rose and went to the top of the stairs. At the bottom of the flight he saw a woman standing, and on her turning up her face recognized the pale, dark-eyed Izz Hewitt. "Mr. Clare," she said, "I've called to see you and Mrs. Clare, and to inquire if ye be well. I thought ye might be back here again." This was a girl whose secret he had guessed, but who had not yet guessed his. An honest girl who loved him, one who would have made as good or nearly as good a practical farmer's wife as Tess. "I'm here alone," he said. "We are not living here now." Explaining why he had come, he asked, "Which way are you going home, Izz?" "I've no home at Talbothays Dairy now, sir," she said. "Why's that?" Izz looked down. "It was so dismal there that I left. I'm staying out this way. She pointed in a contrary direction, the direction in which he was journeying. Well, are you going there now? I can take you if you wish for a lift. Her olive complexion grew richer in hue. Thank ye, Mr. Clare, she said. He soon found the farmer and settled the account for his rent and the few other items which had to be considered by reason of the sudden abandonment of the lodging. On Clare's return to his horse and gig, Izz jumped up beside him. I'm going to leave England, Izz, he said as they drove on. Going to Brazil. And do Mrs. Clare like the notion of such a journey? She asked. She is not going at present. Say for a year or so. I'm going out to reconnoitre, to see what life there is like. They sped along eastward for some considerable distance, Izz making no observation. How are the others? He inquired. How is Retty? She was in a sort of nervous state when I zid her last, and so thin and hollow-cheeked that I do seem in decline. Nobody will ever fall in love with her any more, said Izz absently. And Marian? Izz lowered her voice. Marian drinks. Indeed? Yes. The dairyman has got rid of her. And you? I don't drink, and I bain't in a decline, but I'm no great things at singing afore breakfast now. How is that? Do you remember how neatly you used to turn "'Twas down in Cupid's gardens" and "The tailor's breeches" at morning milking? Ah, yes. When you first came, sir, that was. Not when you had been there a bit. Why was that falling off? Her black eyes flashed up to his face for one moment by way of answer. Izz, how weak of you, for such as I, he said, and fell into reverie. Then suppose I had asked you to marry me. If you had, I should have said yes, and you would have married a woman who loved ye. Really? Down to the ground, she whispered vehemently. Oh my God, did you never guess it till now? By and by they reached a branch road to a village. I must get down. I live out there, said Izz abruptly, having never spoken since her avowal. Clare slowed the horse. He was incensed against his fate, bitterly disposed towards social ordinances, for they had cooped him up in a corner out of which there was no legitimate pathway. Why not be revenged on society by shaping his future domesticities loosely, instead of kissing the pedagogic rod of convention in this ensnaring manner? I'm going to Brazil alone, Izz, said he. I have separated from my wife for personal, not voyaging reasons. I may never live with her again. I may not be able to love you, but will you go with me instead of her? You truly wish me to go? I do. I have been badly used enough to wish for relief, and you at least love me disinterestedly. Yes, I will go, said Izz after a pause. You will? You know what it means, Izz? It means that I shall live with you for the time you're over there. That's good enough for me. Remember, you are not to trust me in morals now, but I ought to remind you that it will be wrong-doing in the eyes of civilization. Western civilization, that is to say. I don't mind that. No woman do when it comes to agony point, and there's no other way. Then don't get down, but sit where you are. He drove past the crossroads, 1 mile, 2 miles, without showing any signs of affection. You love me very, very much, Izz? He suddenly asked. I do. I've said I do. I loved you all the time we was at the dairy together. More than Tess? She shook her head. No, she murmured. Not more than she. How's that?
Because nobody could love 'ee more than Tess did. She would have laid down her life for 'ee. I could do no more."
Like the prophet on top of Peor, Izz Hewitt would fain have spoken perversely at such a moment, but the fascination exercised over her rougher nature by Tess's character compelled her to grace. Clare was silent. His heart had risen at these straightforward words from such an unexpected, unimpeachable quarter. In his throat was something as if a sob had solidified there. His ears repeated, "She would have laid down her life for 'ee. I could do no more." "Forget our idle talk, Izz," he said, turning the horse's head suddenly. "I don't know what I've been saying. I will drive you back to where your lane branches off." "So much for honesty towards 'ee. Oh, how can I bear it? How can I? How can I?" Izz Hewitt burst into tears and beat her forehead as she saw what she had done. "Do you regret that poor little act of justice to an absent one? Oh, Izz, don't spoil it by regret." She stilled herself by degrees. "Very well, sir. Perhaps I didn't know what I was saying either. When I agreed to go, I wish what cannot be." "Because I have a loving wife already." Yes, you have." They reached the corner of the lane which they had passed half an hour earlier, and she hopped down. "Izz, please forgive my momentary levity," he cried. "It was so ill-considered, so ill-advised." "Forget it? Never, never. Oh, it was no levity to me." He felt how richly he deserved the reproach that the wounded cry conveyed, and, in a sorrow that was inexpressible, leapt down and took her hand. "Well, but Izz, we'll part friends anyhow. You don't know what I've had to bear." She was a really generous girl, and allowed no further bitterness to mar their adieu. "I forgive 'ee, sir," she said. "Now, Izz," he said, while she stood beside him there, forcing himself to the mentor's part he was far from feeling, "I want you to tell Marian when you see her that she is to be a good woman and not to give way to folly. Promise that. And tell Retty that there are more worthy men than I in the world, that for my sake she is to act wisely and well. Remember the words, wisely and well, for my sake. I send this message to them as a dying man to the dying, for I shall never see them again. And you, Izzy, you have saved me by your honest words about my wife from an incredible impulse towards folly and treachery. Women may be bad, but they are not so bad as men in these things. On that one account I can never forget you. Be always the good and sincere girl you've hitherto been, and think of me as a worthless lover, but a faithful friend. Promise." She gave the promise. "Heaven bless and keep you, sir. Goodbye." He drove on, and no sooner had Izz turned into the lane and Clare was out of sight than she flung herself down on the bank in a fit of raking anguish, and it was with a strained, unnatural face that she entered her mother's cottage late that night. No one ever was told how Izz spent the dark hours that intervened between Angel Clare's parting from her and her arrival home. Clare, too, after bidding the girl farewell, was wrought to aching thoughts and quivering lips. But his sorrow was not for Izz. That evening he was within a featherweight's turn of abandoning his road to the nearest station and driving across that elevated dorsal line of South Wessex which divided him from Tess's home. It was neither a contempt for her nature nor the probable state of her heart which deterred him. No, it was a sense that, despite her love, as corroborated by Izz's admission, the facts had not changed. If he was right at first, he was right now, and the momentum of the course on which he had embarked tended to keep him going in it, unless diverted by a stronger, more sustained force than had played upon him this afternoon. He could soon come back to her. He took the train that night for London, and 5 days after shook hands in farewell of his brothers at the port of embarkation. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41. From the foregoing events of the winter time let us press on to an October day, more than 8 months subsequent to the parting of Clare and Tess. We discover the latter in changed condition. Instead of a bride with boxes and trunks which others bore, we see her a lonely woman, with a basket and a bundle in her own porterage, as in an earlier time when she was no bride. Instead of the ample means that were projected by her husband for her comfort through this probationary period, she can produce only a flattened purse. After again leaving Marlott, her home, she had got through the spring and summer without any great stress upon her physical powers, the time being mainly spent in rendering light irregular service at dairy work near Port Bredy to the west of the Blackmore Valley, equally remote from her native place and from Talbothays. She preferred this to living on his allowance. Mentally, she remained in utter stagnation, a condition which the mechanical occupation rather fostered than checked. Her consciousness was at that other dairy, at that other season, in the presence of the tender lover who had confronted her there, he who the moment she had grasped him to keep for her own had disappeared like a shape in a vision. The dairy work lasted only till the milk began to lessen, for she had not met with a second regular engagement as at Talbothays, but had done duty as a supernumerary only. However, as harvest was now beginning, she had simply to remove from the pasture to the stubble to find plenty of further occupation, and this continued till harvest was done. Of the £25 which remained to her of Clare's allowance, after deducting the other half of the 50 as a contribution to her parents for the trouble and expense to which she had put them, she had as yet spent but little. But there now followed an unfortunate interval of wet weather, during which she was obliged to fall back upon her sovereigns. She could not bear to let them go. Angel had put them into her hand, had obtained them bright and new from his bank for her. His touch had consecrated them to souvenirs of himself. They appeared to have had as yet no other history than such as was created by his and her own experiences, and to disperse them was like giving away relics. But she had to do it, and one by one they left her hands. She had been compelled to send her mother her address from time to time, but she concealed her circumstances. When her money had almost gone, a letter from her mother reached her. Joan stated they were in terrible difficulty. The autumn rains had gone through the thatch of the house, which required entire renewal. But this could not be done because the previous thatching had never been paid for. New rafters and a new ceiling upstairs also were required, which, with the previous bill, would amount to the sum of £20. As her husband was a man of means, and had doubtless returned by this time, could she not send them the money? Tess had £30 coming to her almost immediately from Angel's bankers, and the case being so deplorable, as soon as the sum was received she sent the 20 as requested. Part of the remainder she was obliged to expend in winter clothing, leaving only a nominal sum for the whole inclement season at hand. When the last pound had gone, a remark of Angel's that whenever she required further resources she was to apply to his father remained to be considered. But the more Tess thought of the step, the more reluctant was she to take it. The same delicacy, pride, false shame, whatever it may be called, on Clare's account, which had led her to hide from her own parents the prolongation of the estrangement, hindered her in owning to his that she was in want after the fair allowance he had left her. They probably despised her already. How much more they would despise her in the character of a mendicant. The consequence was that by no effort could the parson's daughter-in-law bring herself to let him know her state. Her reluctance to communicate with her husband's parents might, she thought, lessen with the lapse of time, but with her own the reverse obtained. On her leaving their house after the short visit subsequent to her marriage, they were under the impression that she was ultimately going to join her husband, and from that time to the present she had done nothing to disturb their belief that she was awaiting his return in comfort, hoping against hope that his journey to Brazil would result in a short stay only, after which he would come to fetch her, or that he would write for her to join him. In any case, that they would soon present a united front to their families and the world. This hope she still fostered. To let her parents know that she was a deserted wife, dependent, now that she had relieved their necessities, on her own hands for a living, after the éclat of a marriage which was to nullify the collapse of the first attempt, would be too much indeed. The set of brilliants returned to her mind. Where Clare had deposited them she did not know, and it mattered little if it were true that she could only use them and not sell them. Even were they absolutely hers, it would be passing mean to enrich herself by a legal title to them which was not essentially hers at all. Meanwhile her husband's days had been by no means free from trial. At this moment he was lying ill of fever in the clay lands near Curitiba in Brazil, having been drenched with thunderstorms and persecuted by other hardships, in common with all the English farmers and farm labourers who, just at this time, were deluded into going thither by the promises of the Brazilian government, and by the baseless assumption that those frames which, ploughing and sowing on English uplands, had resisted all the weathers to whose moods they had been born, could resist equally well all the weathers by which they were surprised on Brazilian plains. To return. Thus it happened that when the last of Tess's sovereigns had been spent, she was unprovided with to take their place, while on account of the season she found it increasingly difficult to get employment. Not being aware of the rarity of intelligence, energy, health and willingness in any sphere of life, she refrained from seeking an indoor occupation. Fearing towns, large houses, people of means and social sophistication, and of manners other than rural. From that direction of gentility black care had come. Society might be better than she supposed from her slight experience of it, but she had no proof of this, and her instinct in the circumstances was to avoid its purlieus. The small dairies to the west, beyond Port Bredy, in which she had served as supernumerary milkmaid during the spring and summer, required no further aid. Room would probably have been made for her at Talbothays, if only out of sheer compassion, but comfortable as her life had been there, she could not go back. The anticlimax would be too intolerable, and her return might bring reproach upon her idolized husband. She could not have borne their pity, and their whispered remarks to one another upon her strange situation, though she would almost have faced a knowledge of her circumstance by every individual there, so long as her story had remained isolated in the mind of each. It was the interchange of ideas about her that made her sensitiveness wince. Tess could not account for this distinction. She simply knew that she felt it. She was now on her way to an upland farm in the centre of the county, to which she had been recommended by a wandering letter which had reached her from Marian. Marian had somehow heard that Tess was separated from her husband, probably through Izz Hewitt, and the good-natured and now tippling girl, deeming Tess in trouble, had hastened to notify to her former friend that she herself had gone to this upland spot after leaving the dairy, and would like to see her there, where there was room for other hands, if it were really true that she worked again as of old. With the shortening of the days, all hope of obtaining her husband's forgiveness began to leave her, and there was something of the habitude of the wild animal in the unreflecting instinct with which she rambled on, disconnecting her by littles from her eventful past at every step, obliterating her identity, giving no thought to accidents or contingencies which might make a quick discovery of her whereabouts by others of importance to her own happiness, if not to theirs. Among the difficulties of her lonely position, not the least was the attention she excited by her appearance, a certain bearing of distinction which she had caught from Clare being superadded to her natural attractiveness. Whilst the clothes lasted which had been prepared for her marriage, these casual glances of interest caused her no inconvenience, but as soon as she was compelled to don the wrapper of a field woman, rude words were addressed to her more than once, but nothing occurred to cause her bodily fear till a particular November afternoon. She had preferred the country west of the River Brit to the upland farm for which she was now bound, because, for one thing, it was nearer to the home of her husband's father, and to hover about that region unrecognised, with the notion that she might decide to call at the vicarage some day, gave her pleasure. But having once decided to try the higher and drier levels, she pressed back eastward, marching afoot toward the village of Chalk Newton, where she meant to pass the night. The lane was long and unvaried, and, owing to the rapid shortening of the days, dusk came upon her before she was aware. She had reached the top of a hill down which the lane stretched its serpentine length in glimpses, when she heard footsteps behind her back, and in a moment she was overtaken by a man. He stepped up alongside Tess and said, "Good night, my pretty maid," to which she civilly replied. The light still remaining in the sky lit up her face, though the landscape was nearly dark. The man turned round and stared hard at her. "Why, surely it is the young wench who was at Trantridge a while, young Squire d'Urberville's friend. I was there at that time, though I don't live there now." She recognised in him the well-to-do boor whom Angel had knocked down at the inn for addressing her coarsely. A spasm of anguish shot through her, and she returned him no answer. "Be honest enough to own it, that what I said in the town was true, though your fancy man was so up about it. Eh, my sly one? You ought to beg my pardon for that blow of his, considering." Still no answer came from Tess. There seemed only one escape for her hunted soul. She suddenly took to her heels with the speed of the wind, and without looking behind her ran along the road till she came to a gate which opened directly into a plantation. Into this she plunged, and did not pause till she was deep enough in its shade to be safe against any possibility of discovery. Underfoot the leaves were dry, and the foliage of some holly bushes which grew among the deciduous trees was dense enough to keep off draughts. She scraped together the dead leaves till she had formed them into a large heap, making a sort of nest in the middle. Into this Tess crept. Such sleep as she got was naturally fitful. She fancied she heard strange noises, but persuaded herself that they were caused by the breeze. She thought of her husband in some vague warm clime on the other side of the globe, while she was here in the cold. Was there another such wretched being as she in the world? Tess asked herself, and thinking of her wasted life said, "All is vanity." She repeated the words mechanically, till she reflected that this was a most inadequate thought for modern days. Solomon had thought as far as that more than 2,000 years ago. She herself, though not in the van of thinkers, had got much further. If all were only vanity, who would mind it? All was, alas, worse than vanity. Injustice, punishment, exaction, death. The wife of Angel Clare put her hand to her brow and felt its curve, and the edge of her eye sockets perceptible under the soft skin, and thought as she did so that a time would come when that bone would be bare. "I wish it were now," she said. In the midst of these whimsical fancies she heard a new, strange sound among the leaves. It might be the wind, yet there was scarcely any wind. Sometimes it was a palpitation, sometimes a flutter, sometimes it was a sort of gasp or gurgle. Soon she was certain that the noises came from wild creatures of some kind, the more so when, originating in the boughs overhead, they were followed by the fall of a heavy body upon the ground. Had she been ensconced here under other and more pleasant conditions, she would have become alarmed, but outside humanity she had at present no fear. Day at length broke in the sky. When it had been day aloft for some little while, it became day in the wood. Directly the assuring and prosaic life of the world's active hours had grown strong, she crept from under her hillock of leaves and looked around boldly. Then she perceived what had been going on to disturb her. The plantation wherein she had taken shelter ran down at this spot into a peak, which ended it hitherward, outside the hedge being arable ground. Under the trees several pheasants lay about, their rich plumage dabbled with blood. Some were dead, some feebly twitching a wing, some staring up at the sky, some pulsating quickly, some contorted, some stretched out. All of them writhing in agony, except the fortunate ones whose tortures had ended during the night by the inability of nature to bear more. Tess guessed at once the meaning of this. The birds had been driven down into this corner the day before by some shooting party, and while those that had dropped dead under the shot, or had died before nightfall, had been searched for and carried off, many badly wounded birds had escaped and hidden themselves away, or risen among the thick boughs, where they had maintained their position till they grew weaker with loss of blood in the night time, when they had fallen one by one as she had heard them. She had occasionally caught glimpses of these men in girlhood, looking over hedges or peering through bushes, and pointing their guns, strangely accoutred, a bloodthirsty light in their eyes. She had been told that rough and brutal as they seemed just then, they were not like this all the year round, but were in fact quite civil persons, save during certain weeks of autumn and winter, when, like the inhabitants of the Malay Peninsula, they ran amok and made it their purpose to destroy life. In this case, harmless feathered creatures, brought into being by artificial means solely to gratify these propensities, at once so unmannerly and so unchivalrous toward their weaker fellows in nature's teeming family. With the impulse of a soul who could not feel for kindred sufferers as much as for herself, Tess's first thought was to put the still living birds out of their torture, and to this end with her own hands she broke the necks of as many as she could find, leaving them to lie where she had found them till the gamekeepers should come, as they probably would come, to look for them a second time. Poor darlings! To suppose myself the most miserable being on earth in the sight of such misery as yours, she exclaimed, her tears running down as she killed the birds tenderly. And not a twinge of bodily pain about me. I be not mangled, and I be not bleeding, and I have 2 hands to feed and clothe me. She was ashamed of herself for her gloom of the night, based on nothing more tangible than a sense of condemnation under an arbitrary law of society which had no foundation in nature. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42. It was now broad day, and she started again, emerging cautiously upon the highway. But there was no need for caution, not a soul was at hand, and Tess went onward with fortitude, her recollection of the birds' silent endurance of their night of agony impressing upon her the relativity of sorrows and the tolerable nation of her own, if she could once rise high enough to despise opinion, but that she could not do so long as it was held by Clare. She reached Chalk Newton, and breakfasted at an inn where several young men were troublesomely complimentary to her good looks. Somehow she felt hopeful, for was it not possible that her husband also might say these same things to her even yet? She was bound to take care of herself on the chance of it, and to keep off these casual lovers. To this end Tess resolved to run no further risks from her appearance. As soon as she got out of the village she entered a thicket, and took from her basket one of the oldest field gowns, which she had never put on even at the dairy, never since she had worked among the stubble at Marlott. She also, by a felicitous thought, took a handkerchief from her bundle and tied it round her face under her bonnet, covering her chin and half her cheeks and temples, as if she was suffering from toothache. Then, with her little scissors, by the aid of a pocket looking-glass, she mercilessly nipped her eyebrows off, and thus insured against aggressive admiration, she went on her uneven way. "What a muppet of a maid," said the next man who met her to a companion. Tears came into her eyes for very pity of herself as she had heard him. "But I don't care," she said. "Oh no, I don't care. I'll always be ugly now because Angel is not here, and I have nobody to take care of me. My husband that was is gone away, and never will love me any more. But I love him just the same, and hate all other men, and like to make 'em think scornfully of me." Thus Tess walks on, a figure which is part of the landscape, a field woman, pure and simple, in winter guise, a grey serge cap, a red woollen cravat, a stuff skirt covered by a whitey-brown rough wrapper, and buff leather gloves. Every thread of that old attire has become faded and thin under the stroke of raindrops, the burn of sunbeams, and the stress of winds. There is no sign of young passion in her now. The maiden's mouth is cold, fold over simple fold, binding her head. Inside this exterior, over which the eye might have roved, as over a thing scarcely percipient, almost inorganic, there was the record of a pulsating life which had learned too well for its years of the dust and ashes of things, of the cruelty of lust and the fragility of love. Next day the weather was bad, but she trudged on, the honesty, directness, and impartiality of elemental enmity disconcerting her but little. Her object being a winter's occupation and a winter's home, there was no time to lose. Her experience of short hirings had been such that she was determined to accept no more. Thus she went forward from farm to farm in the direction of the place whence Marian had written to her, which she determined to make use of as a last shift only, its rumoured stringencies being the reverse of tempting. First she inquired for the lighter kinds of employment, and, as acceptance of any variety of those grew hopeless, applied for the less light, till, beginning with the dairy and poultry tendance that she liked best, she ended with the heavy and coarse pursuits which she liked least, work on arable land, work of such roughness indeed as she would never have deliberately volunteered for. Towards the second evening she reached the irregular chalk tableland or plateau, bosomed with semi-globular tumuli, as if Sybil the many-breasted was supinely extended there, which stretched between the valley of her birth and the valley of her love. Here the air was dry and cold, and the long cart roads were blown white and dusty within a few hours after rain. There were few trees, or none, those that would have grown in the hedges being mercilessly plashed down with the quickset by the tenant farmers, the natural enemies of tree, brush and brake. In the middle distance ahead of her she could see the summits of Bulbarrow and Nettlecombe Tout, and they seemed friendly. They had a low and unassuming aspect from this upland, though as approached on the other side from Blackmoor in her childhood, they were as lofty bastions against the sky. Southerly, at many miles' distance, and over the hills and ridges coastward, she could discern a surface like polished steel. It was the English Channel, at a point far out towards France. Before her, in a slight depression, were the remains of a village. She had in fact reached Flintcombe Ash, the place of Marian's sojourn. There seemed to be no help for it. Hither she was doomed to come. The stubborn soil around her showed plainly enough that the kind of labour in demand here was of the roughest kind. But it was time to rest from searching, and she resolved to stay, particularly as it began to rain. At the entrance to the village was a cottage whose gable jutted into the road, and before applying for a lodging she stood under its shelter and watched the evening close in. "Who would think I was Mrs. Angel Clare?" she said. The wall felt warm to her back and shoulders, and she found that immediately within the gable was the cottage fireplace, the heat of which came through the bricks. She warmed her hands upon them, and also put her cheek, red and moist with the drizzle, against their comforting surface. The wall seemed to be the only friend she had. She had so little wish to leave it that she could have stayed there all night. Tess could hear the occupants of the cottage, gathered together after their day's labour, talking to each other within, and the rattle of their supper plates was also audible. But in the village street she had seen no soul as yet. The solitude was at last broken by the approach of one feminine figure, who, though the evening was cold, wore the print gown and the tilt bonnet of summer-time. Tess instinctively thought it might be Marian, and when she came near enough to be distinguishable in the gloom, surely enough it was she. Marian was even stouter and redder in the face than formerly, and decidedly shabbier in attire. At any previous period of her existence Tess would hardly have cared to renew the acquaintance in such conditions, but her loneliness was aggressive, and she responded readily to Marian's greeting. Marian was quite respectful in her inquiries, but seemed much moved by the fact that Tess should still continue in no better condition than at first, though she had dimly heard of the separation. "Tess, Mrs. Clare, the dear wife of dear he! And is it really so bad as this, my child? Why is your comely face tied up in such a way? Anybody been beating 'ee? Not he?" "No, no, no. I merely did it not to be clipsed or called, Marian." She pulled off in disgust a bandage which could suggest such wild thoughts. "And you've got no collar on." Tess had been accustomed to wear a little white collar at the dairy. "I know it, Marian." "You've lost it travelling." "I've not lost it. The truth is I don't care anything about my looks, so I didn't put it on." "And you don't wear your wedding ring?" "Yes, I do, but not in public. I wear it round my neck on a ribbon. I don't wish people to think who I am by marriage, or that I am married at all. It would be so awkward while I lead my present life." Marian paused. "But you be a gentleman's wife, and it seems hardly fair that you should live like this." "Oh yes, it is. Quite fair, though I am very unhappy." "Well, well, he married you, and you can be unhappy." "Wives are unhappy sometimes, from no fault of their husbands, from their own." "You've got no faults, dearie, that I'm sure of, and he's none, so it must be something outside ye both." "Marian, dear Marian, will you do me a good turn without asking questions? My husband has gone abroad, and somehow I have overrun my allowance, so that I have had to fall back upon my own work for a time. Do not call me Mrs. Clare, but Tess, as before. Do they want a hand there?" "Oh yes, they'll take one always, because few care to come. 'Tis a starve-acre place. Corn and swedes are all they grow. Though I be here myself, I fear 'tis a pity for such as you to come." "But you used to be as good a dairy woman as I."
Yes, but I've got out of that since I took to drink. Lord, that's the only comfort I've got now. But if you engage, you'll be set sweet hacking. That's what I be doing, and you won't like it. Oh, anything. Will you speak for me? You will do better by speaking for yourself. Very well. Now, Mariam, remember, nothing about him if I get the place. I don't wish to bring his name down to the dirt. Marian, who was really a trustworthy girl, though of courser grain than Tess, promised anything she asked. "This is pay night," she said, "and if you were to come with me you would know at once. I be real sorry that you are not happy, but 'tis because he's away, I know. You couldn't be unhappy if he was here, even if he gid thee no money, even if he used you like a drudge." "That's true. I could not." They walked on together, and soon reached the farmhouse, which was almost sublime in its dreariness. There was not a tree within sight. There was not, at this season, a green pasture, nothing but fallow and turnips everywhere, in large fields divided by hedges, plashed to unrelieved levels. Tess waited outside the door of the farmhouse till the group of workfolk had received their wages, and then Marian introduced her. The farmer himself, it appeared, was not at home, but his wife, who represented him this evening, made no objection to hiring Tess, on her agreeing to remain till Old Lady Day. Female field labour was seldom offered now, and its cheapness made it profitable for tasks which women could perform as readily as men. Having signed the agreement, there was nothing more for Tess to do at present than to get a lodging, and she found one in the house at whose gable wall she had warmed herself. It was a poor subsistence that she had ensured, but it would afford a shelter for the winter at any rate. That night she wrote to inform her parents of her new address, in case a letter should arrive at Marlott from her husband. But she did not tell them of the sorriness of her situation. It might have brought reproach upon him. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43. There was no exaggeration in Marian's definition of Flintcombe Ash Farm as a starve-acre place. The single fat thing on the soil was Marian herself, and she was an importation. Of the three classes of village, the village cared for by its lord, the village cared for by itself, and the village uncared for either by itself or by its lord, in other words, the village of a resident squire's tenantry, the village of free or copyholders, and the absentee owner's village farmed with land, this place, Flintcombe Ash, was the third. But Tess set to work. Patience, that blending of moral courage and physical timidity, was now no longer a minor feature in Mrs. Angel Clare, and it sustained her. The swede field in which she and her companion were set hacking was a stretch of 100-odd acres in one patch, on the highest ground of the farm, rising above stony lanchets or lynchets, the outcrop of silicous veins in the chalk formation, composed of myriads of loose white flints in bulbous, cusped and phallic shapes. The upper half of each turnip had been eaten off by the livestock, and it was the business of the two women to grub up the lower or earthy half of the root with a hooked fork called a hacker, that it might be eaten also. Every leaf of the vegetable having already been consumed, the whole field was in colour a desolate drab. It was a complexion without features, as if a face, from chin to brow, should be only an expanse of skin. The sky wore, in another colour, the same likeness, a white vacuity of countenance with the lineaments gone. So these two upper and nether visages confronted each other all day long, the white face looking down on the brown face, and the brown face looking up at the white face, without anything standing between them but the two girls crawling over the surface of the former like flies. Nobody came near them, and their movements showed a mechanical regularity, their forms standing enshrouded in Hessian wroppers,
sleeved brown pinafores tied behind to the bottom to keep their gowns from blowing about, scant skirts revealing boots that reached high up the ankles, and yellow sheepskin gloves with gauntlets. The pensive character which the curtained hood lent to their bent heads would have reminded the observer of some early Italian conception of the two Marys. They worked on, hour after hour, unconscious of the forlorn aspect they bore on the landscape, not thinking of the justice or injustice of their lot. Even in such a position as theirs it was possible to exist in a dream. In the afternoon the rain came on again, and Marian said that they need not work any more. But if they did not work they would not get paid, so they worked on. It was so high a situation, this field, that the rain had on no occasion to fall, but raced along horizontally upon the yelling wind, sticking into them like glass splinters till they were wet through. Tess had not known till now what was really meant by that. There are degrees of dampness, and a very little is called being wet through in common talk. But to stand working slowly in a field and feel the creep of rainwater, first on legs and shoulders, then on hips and head, then at back, front and sides, and yet to work on till the leaden light diminishes and marks that the sun is down, demands a distinct modicum of stoicism, even of valour. Yet they did not feel the wetness so much as might be supposed. They were both young, and they were talking of the time when they lived and loved together at Talbothays Dairy, that happy green tract of land where summer had been liberal in her gifts, in substance to all, emotionally to these. Tess would fain not have conversed with Marian of the man who was legally, if not actually, her husband, but the irresistible fascination of the subject betrayed her into reciprocating Marian's remarks. And thus, as it has been said, though the damp curtains of their bonnets flapped smartly into their faces, and their wrappers clung about them to wearisomeness, they lived all this afternoon in memories of green, sunny, romantic Talbothays. "You can see a gleam of a hill within a few miles of Froom Valley from here when 'tis fine," said Marian. "Ah, can you?" said Tess, awake to the new value of this locality. So the two forces were at work here as everywhere, the inherent will to enjoy and the circumstantial will against enjoyment. Marian's will had a method of assisting itself by taking from her pocket, as the afternoon wore on, a pint bottle corked with a white rag, from which she invited Tess to drink. Tess's unassisted power of dreaming, however, being enough for her sublimation at present, she declined, except the merest sip, and then Marian took a pull herself from the spirits. "I've got used to it," she said, "and can't leave it off now. 'Tis my only comfort. You see, I lost him. You didn't, and you can do without it perhaps." Tess thought her loss as great as Marian's, but upheld by the dignity of being Angel's wife, in the letter at least, she accepted Marian's differentiation. Amid this scene Tess slaved in the morning frosts and in the afternoon rains. When it was not swede grubbing, it was swede trimming, in which process they sliced off the earth and the fibres with a billhook before storing the roots for future use. At this occupation they could shelter themselves by a thatched hurdle if it rained, but if it was frosty, even their thick leather gloves could not prevent the frozen masses they handled from biting their fingers. Still Tess hoped. She had a conviction that sooner or later the magnanimity which she persisted in reckoning as a chief ingredient of Clare's character would lead him to rejoin her. Marian, primed to a humorous mood, would discover the queer-shaped flints aforesaid and shriek with laughter, Tess remaining severely obtuse. They often looked across the country to where the Var or Froom was known to stretch, even though they might not be able to see it, and fixing their eyes on the cloaking grey mist, imagined the old times that they had spent out there. "Ah," said Marian, "how I should like another or two of our old set to come here, when we could bring up Talbothays every day here afield, and talk of what nice times we had there, and all the things we used to know, and make it all come back again a'most, in seeming." Marian's eyes softened, and her voice grew vague as the visions returned. "I'll write to Is Hewett," she said. "She's biding at home doing nothing now, I know. And I'll tell her we be here, and ask her to come, and perhaps Retty is well enough now." Tess had nothing to say against this proposal, and the next she heard of the plan for importing old Talbothays joys was 2 or 3 days later, when Marian informed her that Izz had replied to her inquiry and had promised to come if she could. There had not been such a winter for years. It came on in steadily and measured glides, like the moves of a chess player. One morning the few lonely trees and the thorns of the hedgerows appeared as if they had put off a vegetable for an animal integument. Every twig was covered with a white nap, as of fur grown from the rind during the night, giving it 4 or 5 times its usual stoutness, the whole bush or tree forming a staring sketch in white lines on the mournful grey of the sky and horizon. Cobwebs revealed their presence on sheds and walls where none had been observed, till brought out into visibility by the crystallizing atmosphere, hanging like loops of white worsted from salient points of the outhouses, posts and gates. After this season of congealed dampness came a spell of dry frost, when strange birds from behind the North Pole began to arrive silently on the upland of Flintcombe Ash. Gaunt spectral creatures with tragical eyes which had witnessed scenes of cataclysmal horror in inaccessible polar regions of a magnitude such as no human being has ever conceived, in curdling temperatures that no man could endure, which had beheld the crash of icebergs and the slide of snow hills by the shooting light of the aurora, been half blinded by the whirl of colossal storms and terraqueous distortions, and retained the expression of feature such scenes had engendered. These nameless birds came quite near to Tess and Marian, but of all they had seen which humanity would never see, they brought no account. The traveller's ambition to tell was not theirs, and with dumb impassivity they dismissed experiences which they did not value for the immediate incidents of this homely upland. The trivial movements of the 2 girls in disturbing the clods with their hackers so as to uncover something or other that these visitants relished as food. Then one day a peculiar quality invaded the air of this open country. There came a moisture which was not of rain, and a cold which was not of frost. It chilled the eyeballs of the twain, made their brows ache, penetrated to their skeletons, affecting the surface of the body less than its core. They knew that it meant snow, and in the night the snow came. Tess, who continued to live at the cottage with the warm gable that cheered any lonely pedestrian who paused beside it, awoke in the night and heard above the thatch noises which seemed to signify that the roof had turned itself into a gymnasium of all the winds. When she lit her lamp to get up in the morning, she found that the snow had been blown through a chink in the casement, forming a white cone of the finest powder against the inside, and had also come down the chimney, so that it lay sole deep upon the floor, on which her shoes left tracks when she moved about. Without, the storm drove so fast as to create a snow mist in the kitchen, but as yet it was too dark out of doors to see anything. Tess knew that it was impossible to go on with the Swedes, and by the time she had finished breakfast beside the solitary little lamp, Marian arrived to tell her that they were to join the rest of the women at reed drawing in the barn till the weather changed. As soon, therefore, as the uniform cloak of darkness without began to turn into a disordered medley of greys, they blew out the lamp, wrapped themselves up in their thickest pinners, tied their woolen cravats round their necks and across their chests, and started for the barn. The snow had followed the birds from the polar basin as a white pillar of a cloud, and individual flakes could not be seen. The blast smelt of icebergs, Arctic seas, whales, and white bears, carrying the snow so that it licked the land but did not deepen on it. They trudged onwards with slanted bodies through the flossy fields, keeping as well as they could in the shelter of hedges, which, however, acted as strainers rather than screens. The air, afflicted to pallor with the hoary multitudes that infested it, twisted and spun them eccentrically, suggesting an achromatic chaos of things. But both the young women were fairly cheerful. Such weather on a dry upland is not in itself dispiriting. "Ha, the cunning northern birds knew this was a-coming," said Marian. "Depend on't. They keep just in front on't all the way from the North Star. Your husband, my dear, is, I make no doubt, having scorching weather all this time. Lord, if he could only see his pretty wife now. Not that this weather hurts your beauty at all. In fact, it rather does it good." "You mustn't talk about him to me, Marian," said Tess severely. "Well, but surely you care for him, do you?" Instead of answering, Tess, with tears in her eyes, impulsively faced in the direction in which she had imagined South America to lie, and putting up her lips, blew out a passionate kiss upon the snowy wind. "Well, well, I know you do, but, 'pon my body, it is a rum life for a married couple. There, I won't say another word. Well, as for the weather, it won't hurt us in the wheat barn, but reed drawing is fearful hard work, worse than swede hacking. I can stand it because I'm stout, but you be slimmer than I. I can't think why Maister should have set 'ee at it." They reached the wheat barn and entered it. One end of the low structure was full of corn. The middle was where the reed drawing was carried on, and there had already been placed in the reed press the evening before as many sheaves of wheat as would be sufficient for the women to draw from during the day. "Why, here's Izz," said Marian. Izz it was, and she came forward. She had walked all the way from her mother's home on the previous afternoon, and, not deeming the distance so great, had been belated, arriving, however, just before the snow began, and sleeping at the alehouse. The farmer had agreed with her mother at market to take her on if she came today, and she had been afraid to disappoint him by delay. In addition to Tess, Marian and Izz, there were two women from a neighbouring village, two Amazonian sisters, whom Tess with a start remembered as Dark Car, the Queen of Spades, and her junior, the Queen of Diamonds, those who had tried to fight with her in the midnight quarrel at Trantridge. They showed no recognition of her, and possibly had none, for they had been under the influence of liquor on that occasion, and were only temporary sojourners there as here. They did all kinds of men's work by preference, including well sinking, hedging, ditching and excavating, without any sense of fatigue. Noted reed drawers they were too, and looked round upon the other three with some superciliousness. Putting on their gloves, all set to work in a row in front of the press, an erection formed of two posts connected by a crossbeam, under which the sheaves to be drawn from were laid ears outward, the beam being pegged down by pins in the uprights and lowered as the sheaves diminished. The day hardened in colour, the night coming in at the barn doors upwards from the snow instead of downwards from the sky. The girls pulled handful after handful from the press, but by reason of the presence of the strange women, who were recounting scandals, Marian and Izz could not at first talk of old times as they wished to do. Presently they heard the muffled tread of a horse, and the farmer rode up to the barn door. When he had dismounted he came close to Tess, and remained looking musingly at the side of her face. She had not turned at first, but his fixed attitude led her to look around, when she perceived that her employer was the native of Trantridge from whom she had taken flight on the high road because of his allusion to her history. He waited till she had carried the drawn bundles to the piles outside, when he said, "So you be the young woman who took my civility in such ill part. Be drowned if I didn't think you might be as soon as I heard of your being hired. Well, you thought you had got the better of me the first time at the inn with your fancy man, and the second time on the road when you bolted. But now I think I've got the better of you," he concluded with a hard laugh. Tess, between the Amazons and the farmer like a bird caught in a clap net, returned no answer, continuing to pull the straw. She could read the character sufficiently well to know by this time that she had nothing to fear from her employer's gallantry. It was rather the tyranny induced by his mortification at Clare's treatment of him. Upon the whole she preferred that sentiment in man, and was brave enough to endure it. "You thought I was in love with thee, I suppose. Some women are such fools to take every look as serious earnest. But there's nothing like a winter afield for taking that nonsense out of the young wenches' heads, and you've signed on and agreed till Lady Day. Now, are you going to beg my pardon?" "I think you ought to beg mine." "Very well, as you like it, and we'll see which is master here. Be they all the sheaves you've done to-day?" "Yes, sir." "'Tis a very poor show. Just see what they've done over there," pointing to the two stalwart women. "The rest too have done better than you." "They've all practised it before, and I have not. And I thought it made no difference to you, as it is task work, and we are only paid for what we do." "Oh, but it does. I want the barn cleared." "I'm going to work all afternoon instead of leaving at 2 as the others will do." He looked sullenly at her and went away. Tess felt that she could not have come to a much worse place, but anything was better than gallantry. When 2 o'clock arrived, the professional reed drawers tossed off their last half-pint in their flagon, put down their hooks, tied their last sheaves, and went away. Marian and Izz would have done likewise, but on hearing that Tess meant to stay, to make up by longer hours for her lack of skill, they would not leave her. Looking out at the snow, which still fell, Marian exclaimed, "Now we've got it all to ourselves." And so at last the conversation turned to their old experiences at the dairy, and of course the incidents of their affection for Angel Clare. "Izz and Marian," said Mrs. Angel Clare with a dignity which was extremely touching, seeing how very little of a wife she was, "I can't join in talk with you now as I used to do about Mr. Clare. You will see that I cannot, because though he has gone away from me for the present, he is my husband." Izz was by nature the sauciest and most caustic of all the 4 girls who had loved Clare. "He was a splendid lover, no doubt," she said, "but I don't think he's too fond a husband to go away from you so soon." "He had to go. He was obliged to go, to see about the land over there," pleaded Tess. "He might have tidied it over the winter." "Ah, that's owing to an accident, a misunderstanding, and we won't argue it," Tess answered, with tearfulness in her words. "Perhaps there's a good deal to be said for him. He did not go away like some husbands without telling me, and I can always find out where he is." After this they continued for some long time in a reverie, as they went on seizing the ears of corn, drawing out the straw, gathering it under their arms, and cutting off the ears with their bill-hooks, nothing sounding in the barn but the swish of the straw and the crunch of the hook. Then Tess suddenly flagged, and sank down upon the heap of wheat ears at her feet. "I knew you wouldn't be able to stand it," cried Marian. "It wants harder flesh than yours for this work." Just then the farmer entered. "Oh, that's how you get on while I'm away," he said to her. "But it is my own loss," she pleaded, "not yours." "I want it finished. he said doggedly as he crossed the barn and went out at the other door.
"Don't 'ee mind him, there's a dear," said Marian. "I've worked here before. Now you go and lie down there, and Izz and I will make up your number." "I don't like to let you do that. I'm taller than you too."
However, she was so overcome that she consented to lie down a while, and reclined on a heap of pull-tails, the refuse after the straight straw had been drawn, thrown up at the further side of the barn. Her succumbing had been as largely owing to agitation at reopening the subject of her separation from her husband as to the hard work. She lay in a state of percipience without volition, and the rustle of the straw and the cutting of the ears by the others had the weight of bodily touches. She could hear from her corner, in addition to these noises, the murmur of their voices. She felt certain that they were continuing the subject already broached, but their voices were so low that she could not catch the words. At last Tess grew more and more anxious to know what they were saying, and persuading herself that she felt better, she got up and resumed work. Then Izz Hewitt broke down. She had walked more than a dozen miles the previous evening, had gone to bed at midnight, and had risen again at 5 o'clock. Marian alone, thanks to her bottle of liquor and her stoutness of build, stood the strain upon back and arms without suffering. Tess urged Izz to leave off, agreeing as she felt better to finish the day without her, and make equal division of the number of sheaves. Izz accepted the offer gratefully, and disappeared through the great door into the snowy tract to her lodging. Marian, as was the case every afternoon at this time on account of the bottle, began to feel in a romantic vein. "I should not have thought it of him, never," she said in a dreamy tone. "And I loved him so. I didn't mind his having you, but this about Izz is too bad." Tess, in her start at the words, narrowly missed cutting off a finger with the billhook. "Is it about my husband?" she stammered. "Well, yes. Izz said, 'Don't 'ee tell her,' but I'm sure I can't help it. It was what he wanted Izz to do. He wanted her to go off to Brazil with him." Tess's face faded as white as the scene without, and its curves straightened. "And did Izz refuse to go?" she asked. "I don't know. Anyhow, he changed his mind." "Pooh! Then he didn't mean it. 'Twas just a man's jest." "Yes, he did, for he drove her a good ways toward the station." "He didn't take her?" They pulled on in silence till Tess, without any premonitory symptoms, burst out crying. "There," said Marian. "Now I wish I hadn't told 'ee." "No, it is a very good thing that you have done. I have been living on in a third-over lack-a-day way, and have not seen what it might lead to. I ought to have sent him a letter oftener. He said I could not go to him, but he didn't say I was not to write as often as I liked. I won't dally like this any longer. I have been very wrong and neglectful in leaving everything to be done by him." The dim light in the barn grew dimmer, and they could see to work no longer. When Tess had reached home that evening, and had entered into the privacy of her little whitewashed chamber, she began impetuously writing a letter to Clare. But falling into doubt, she could not finish it. Afterwards she took the ring from the ribbon on which she wore it next to her heart, and retained it on her finger all night, as if to fortify herself with the sensation that she was really the wife of this elusive lover of hers, who could propose that Izz could go with him abroad so shortly after he had left her. Knowing that, how could she write entreaties to him, or show that she cared for him any more? End of chapter 43. Chapter 44. By the disclosure in the barn her thoughts were led anew in the direction which they had taken more than once of late, to the distant Emminster vicarage. It was through her husband's parents that she had been charged to send a letter to Clare if she desired, and to write to them direct if in difficulty. But that sense of her having morally no claim upon him had always led Tess to suspend her impulse to send these notes, and to the family at the vicarage, therefore, as to her own parents, since her marriage, she was virtually non-existent. This self-effacement in both directions had been in consonance with her independent character of desiring nothing by way of favour or pity to which she was not entitled on a fair consideration of her deserts. She had set herself to stand or fall by her qualities, and to waive such merely technical claims upon a strange family as had been established for her by the flimsy fact of a member of that family, in a season of impulse, writing his name in a church book beside hers. Now that she was stung to a fever by Izzy's tale, there was a limit to her powers of renunciation. Why had her husband not written to her? He had distinctly implied that he would at least let her know of the locality to which he had journeyed, but he had not sent a line to notify his address. Was he really indifferent? But was he ill? Was it for her to make some advance? Surely she might summon the courage of solicitude, call at the vicarage for intelligence, and express her grief at his silence. If Angel's father were the good man she had heard him represented to be, he would be able to enter into her heart-starved situation. Her social hardships she could conceal. To leave the farm on a weekday was not in her power. Sunday was the only possible opportunity. Flintcombe Ash being in the middle of the Cretaceous tableland over which no railway had climbed as yet, it would be necessary to walk. And the distance being 15 miles each way, she would have to allow herself a long day for the undertaking by rising early. A fortnight later, when the snow had gone, and it had been followed by a hard black frost, she took advantage of the state of the roads to try the experiment. At 4 o'clock that Sunday morning she came downstairs and stepped out into the starlight. The weather was still favourable, the ground ringing under her feet like an anvil. Marian and Izz were much interested in her excursion, knowing that the journey concerned her husband. Their lodgings were in a cottage a little further along the lane, but they came and assisted Tess in her departure, and argued that she should dress up in her very prettiest guise to captivate the hearts of her parents-in-law, though she, knowing of the austere and Calvinistic tenets of old Mr Clare, was indifferent, and even doubtful. A year had now elapsed since her sad marriage, but she had preserved sufficient draperies from the wreck of her then full wardrobe to clothe her very charmingly, as a simple country girl with no pretensions to recent fashion. A soft grey woollen gown, with white crape quilling against the pink skin of her face and neck, and a black velvet jacket and hat. "'Tis 1,000 pities your husband can't see ye now. You do look a real beauty," said Izz Hewitt, regarding Tess as she stood on the threshold between the steely starlight without and the yellow candlelight within. Izz spoke with a magnanimous abandonment of herself to the situation. She could not be, no woman with a heart bigger than a hazelnut could be, antagonistic to Tess in her presence, the influence which she exercised over those of her own sex being of a warmth and strength quite unusual, curiously overpowering the less worthy feminine feelings of spite and rivalry. With a final tug and touch here, and a slight brush there, they let her go, and she was absorbed into the pearly air of the fordawn. They heard her footsteps tap along the hard road as she stepped out to her full pace. Even Izz hoped she would win, and, though without any particular respect for her own virtue, felt glad that she had been prevented from wronging her friend when momentarily tempted by Clare. It was a year ago, all but a day, that Clare had married Tess, and only a few days less than a year than he had been absent from her. Still, to start on a brisk walk, and on such an errand as hers, on a dry, clear, wintry morning, through the rarefied air of those chalky hogbacks, was not depressing, and there was no doubt that her dream at starting was to win the heart of her mother-in-law, tell her whole story to that lady, enlist her on her side, and so gain back the truant. In time she reached the edge of the vast escarpment below which stretched the loamy vale of Blackmoor, now lying misty and still in the dawn. Instead of the colourless air of the uplands, the atmosphere down there was a deep blue. Instead of the great enclosures of 100 acres in which she was now accustomed to toil, there were little fields below her of less than half a dozen acres, so numerous that they looked from this height like the meshes of a net. Here the landscape was whitey brown. Down there, as in Froom Valley, it was always green. Yet it was in that vale that her sorrow had taken place, and she did not love it as formerly. Beauty to her, as to all who have felt, lay not in the thing, but in what the thing symbolized. Keeping the vale on her right, she steered steadily westward, passing above the Hintocks, crossing at right angles the high road from Sherton Abbas to Casterbridge, and skirting Dogbury Hill and High Stoy, with the dell between them called the Devil's Kitchen. Still following the elevated way, she reached Cross in Hand, where the stone pillar stands desolate and silent, to mark the site of a miracle, or murder, or both. 3 miles further she cut across the straight and deserted Roman road called Long Ash Lane, leaving which, as soon as she reached it, she dipped down a hill by a transverse lane into the small town or village of Evershed, being now about halfway over the distance. She made a halt there and breakfasted a second time, heartily enough, not at the Sow and Acorn, for she avoided inns, but at a cottage by the church. The second half of her journey was through a more gentle country, by way of Benville Lane, but as the mileage lessened between her and the spot of her pilgrimage, so did Tess's confidence decrease, and her enterprise loom out more formidably. She saw her purpose in such staring lines, and the landscape so faintly, that she was sometimes in danger of losing her way. However, about noon she paused by a gate on the edge of the basin in which Emminster and its vicarage lay. The square tower, beneath which she knew that at that moment the vicar and his congregation were gathered, had a severe look in her eyes. She wished that she had somehow contrived to come on a weekday. Such a good man might be prejudiced against a woman who had chosen Sunday, never realizing the necessities of her case. But it was incumbent upon her to go on now. She took off the thick boots in which she had walked thus far, put on her pretty thin ones of patent leather, and stuffing the former into the hedge by the gate-post where she might readily find them again, descended the hill. The freshness of colour she had derived from the keen air thinning away in spite of her as she drew near the parsonage. Tess hoped for some accident that might favour her, but nothing favoured her. The shrubs on the vicarage lawn rustled uncomfortably in the frosty breeze. She could not feel by any stretch of imagination, dressed to her highest as she was, that the house was the residence of near relations, and yet nothing essential, in nature or emotion, divided her from them. In pains, pleasures, thoughts, birth, death, and after death, they were the same. She nerved herself by an effort, entered the swing gate, and rang the doorbell. The thing was done. There could be no retreat. No, the thing was not done. Nobody answered to her ringing. The effort had to be risen to and made again. She rang a second time, and the agitation of the act, coupled with her weariness after the 15 miles' walk, led her to support herself while she waited by resting her hand on her hip and her elbow against the wall of the porch. The wind was so nipping that the ivy leaves had become wizened and grey, each tapping incessantly upon its neighbour with a disquieting stir of her nerves. A piece of blood-stained paper, caught up from some meat buyer's dust-heap, beat up and down the road without the gate, too flimsy to rest, too heavy to fly away, and a few straws kept it company. The second peal had been louder, and still nobody came. Then she walked out of the porch, opened the gate, and passed through, and though she looked dubiously at the house front as if inclined to return, it was with a breath of relief that she closed the gate. A feeling haunted her that she might have been recognized, though how she could not tell, and orders been given not to admit her. Tess went as far as the corner. She had done all she could do, but determined not to escape present trepidation at the expense of future distress, she walked back again quite past the house, looking up at all the windows. Ah, the explanation was that they were all at church, every one. She remembered her husband saying that his father always insisted upon the household, servants included, going to morning service, and as a consequence eating cold food when they came home. It was therefore only necessary to wait till the service was over. She would not make herself conspicuous by waiting on the spot, and she started to get past the church into the lane. But as she reached the churchyard gate, the people began pouring out, and Tess found herself in the midst of them. The Emminster congregation looked at her as only a congregation of small country townsfolk walking home at its leisure can look at a woman out of the common whom it perceives to be a stranger. She quickened her pace, and ascended the road by which she had come, to find a retreat between its hedges till the vicar's family should have lunched, and it might be convenient for them to receive her. She stood distant from the churchgoers, except two youngish men, who, linked arm in arm, were beating up behind her at a quick step. As they drew near she could hear their voices engaged in earnest discourse, and with the natural quickness of a woman in her situation did not fail to recognize in these noises the quality of her husband's tones. The pedestrians were his two brothers. Forgetting her plans, Tess's one dread was lest they should overtake her now in her disorganized condition, before she was prepared to confront them, for though she felt that they could not identify her, she instinctively dreaded their scrutiny. The more briskly they walked, the more briskly walked she. They were plainly bent upon taking a short, quick stroll before going indoors to lunch or dinner, to restore warmth to limbs chilled with sitting through a long service. Only one person had preceded Tess up the hill, a ladylike young woman, somewhat interesting, though perhaps a trifle guindée and prudish. Tess had nearly overtaken her when the speed of her brothers-in-law brought them so nearly behind her back that she could hear every word of their conversation. They said nothing, however, which particularly interested her, till, observing the young lady still further in front, one of them remarked, "There is Mercy Chant. Let us overtake her." Tess knew the name. It was the woman who had been destined for Angel's life companion by his and her parents, and whom he probably would have married but for her intrusive self. She would have known as much without previous information, had she waited a moment, for one of the brothers proceeded to say, "Ah, poor Angel, poor Angel! I never see that nice girl without more and more regretting his precipitancy in throwing himself upon a dairymaid, or whatever she may be. It's a queer business, apparently. Whether she has joined him yet or not I don't know, but she had not done so some months ago when I heard from him." "I can't say. He never tells me anything nowadays. His ill-considered marriage seems to have completed that estrangement from me which was begun by his extraordinary opinions." Tess beat up the long hill still faster, but she could not outwalk them without exciting notice. At last they outsped her altogether and passed her by. The young lady still further ahead heard their footsteps and turned. Then there was a greeting and a shaking of hands, and the three went on together. They soon reached the summit of the hill, and evidently intending this point to be the limit of their promenade, slackened pace, and turned all three aside to the gate whereat Tess had paused an hour before that time to reconnoitre the town, before descending into it. During their discourse one of the clerical brothers probed the hedge carefully with his umbrella and dragged something to light. "Here is an old pair of boots," he said. "Thrown away, I suppose, by some tramp or other." "Some impostor who wished to come into the town barefoot, perhaps, and so excite our sympathies," said Miss Chant. "Yes, it must have been, for they are excellent walking boots, by no means worn out. What a wicked thing to do! I'll carry them home for some poor person." Cuthbert Clare, who had been the one to find them, picked them up for her with the crook of his stick, and Tess's boots were appropriated. She, who had heard this, walked past under the screen of her woollen veil till, presently looking back, she perceived that the church party had left the gate with her boots and retreated down the hill. Thereupon our heroine resumed her walk. Tears, blinding tears, were running down her face. She knew that it was all sentiment, all baseless impressibility, which had caused her to read the scene as to her own condemnation. Nevertheless, she could not get over it. She could not contravene in her own defenceless person all those untoward omens. It was impossible to think of returning to the vicarage. Angel's wife felt almost as if she had been hounded up that hill like a scorned thing by those, to her, superfine clerics. Innocently as the slight had been inflicted, it was somewhat unfortunate that she had encountered the sons and not the father, who, despite his narrowness, was far less starched and ironed than they, and had to the full the gift of charity. As she again thought of her dusty boots, she almost pitied those habiliments for the quizzing to which they had been subjected, and felt how hopeless life was for their owner. "Ah," she said, still sighing in pity for herself, "they don't know that I wore those over the roughest part of the road to save these pretty ones he bought for me. No, they did not know it, and they didn't think that he chose the colour of my pretty frock. No, how could they? If they had known, perhaps, they would not have cared, for they don't care much for him, poor thing." Then she grieved for the beloved man whose conventional standard of judgment had caused her all these latter sorrows, and she went her way without knowing that the greatest misfortune of her life was this feminine loss of courage at the last and critical moment through her estimating her father-in-law by his sons. Her present condition was precisely one which would have enlisted the sympathies of old Mr. and Mrs. Clare. Their hearts went out of them at a bound towards extreme cases, when the subtle mental troubles of the less desperate among mankind failed to win their interest or regard. In jumping at publicans and sinners, they would forget that a word might be said for the worries of scribes and Pharisees, and this defect or limitation might have recommended their own daughter-in-law to them at this moment as a fairly choice sort of lost person for their love. Thereupon she began to plod back along the road by which she had come, not altogether full of hope, but full of a conviction that a crisis in her life was approaching. No crisis apparently had supervened, and there was nothing left for her to do but to continue upon that Starve-Acre farm till she could again summon courage to face the vicarage. She did indeed take sufficient interest in herself to throw up her veil on this return journey, as if to let the world see that she could at least exhibit a face such as Mercy Chant could not show. But it was done with a sorry shake of the head. "It is nothing, it is nothing," she said. "Nobody loves it, nobody sees it. Who cares about the looks of a castaway like me?" Her journey back was rather a meander than a march. It had no sprightliness, no purpose, only a tendency. Along the tedious length of Benville Lane she began to grow tired, and she leant upon gates and paused by milestones. She did not enter any house till, at the 7th or 8th mile, she descended the steep long hill below which lay the vicarage or townlet of Evershed, where in the morning she had breakfasted with such contrasting expectations. The cottage by the church, in which she again sat down, was almost the first at that end of the village, and while the woman fetched her some milk from the pantry, Tess, looking down the street, perceived that the place seemed quite deserted. "The people are gone to the afternoon service, I suppose," she said. "No, my dear," said the old woman. "'Tis too soon for that. The bells hain't shook out yet. They be all gone to hear the preaching in yonder barn. A ranter preaches there between the services. An excellent fiery Christian man, they say, but Lord, I don't go to hearing. What comes in the regular way over the pulpit is hot enough for I." Tess soon went onward into the village, her footsteps echoing against the houses as though it was a place of the dead. Nearing the central part, her echoes were intruded on by other sounds, and seeing the barn not far off the road, she guessed these to be the utterances of the preacher. His voice became so distinct in the still clear air that she could soon catch his sentences, though she was on the closed side of the barn. The sermon, as might be expected, was of the extremest antinomian type, on justification by faith, as expounded in the theology of St. Paul. This fixed idea of the rhapsodist was delivered with animated enthusiasm, in a manner entirely declamatory, for he had plainly no skill as a dialectician. Although Tess had not heard the beginning of the address, she heard what the text had been from its constant iteration. "O fool Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you?" Tess was all the more interested, as she stood listening behind, in finding that the preacher's doctrine was of a vehement form of the view of Angel's father, and her interest intensified when the speaker began to detail his own spiritual experiences of how he had come by those views. He had, he said, been the greatest of sinners. He had scoffed, he had wantonly associated with the reckless and the lewd. But a day of awakening had come, and in a human sense it had been brought about mainly by the influence of a certain clergyman whom he had at first grossly insulted, but whose parting words had sunk into his heart and had remained there till, by the grace of heaven, they had worked this change in him and made him what they saw him. But more startling to Tess than the doctrine had been the voice, which, impossible as it seemed, was precisely that of Alec d'Urberville. Her face fixed in painful suspense, she came round to the front of the barn and passed before it. The low winter sun beamed directly upon the great double-doored entrance on this side, one of the doors being open, so that the rays stretched far in over the threshing floor to the preacher and his audience, all snugly sheltered from the northern breeze. The listeners were entirely villagers, among them being the man whom she had seen carrying the red paint-pot on a formal memorable occasion. But her attention was given to the central figure, who stood upon some sacks of corn, facing the people and the door. The 3 o'clock sun shone full upon him, and the strange enervating conviction that her seducer confronted her, which had been gaining ground in Tess ever since she had heard his words distinctly, was at last established as a fact indeed. End of chapter 44 and end of phase the 5th. Phase the 6th. The Convert. Chapter 45. Till this moment she had never seen or heard from d'Urberville since her departure from Trantridge. The re-encounter came at a heavy moment, one of all moments calculated to permit its impact with the least emotional shock. But such was unreasoned memory that, though he stood there openly and palpably a converted man who was sorrowing for his past irregularities, a fear overcame her, paralysing her movement, so that she neither retreated nor advanced. To think of what emanated from that countenance when she saw it last, and to behold it now. There was the same unpleasantness of mien, but now he wore neatly trimmed, old-fashioned whiskers, the sable moustache having disappeared, and his dress was half clerical, a modification which had changed his expression sufficiently to abstract the dandyism from his features, and to hinder for a second her belief in his identity. To Tess's sense there was, just at first, a ghastly bizarrerie, a grim incongruity in the march of these solemn words of Scripture out of such a mouth. This too familiar intonation, less than 4 years earlier, had brought to her ears expressions of such divergent purpose that her heart became quite sick at the irony of the contrast. It was less of a reform than a transfiguration. The former curves of sensuousness were now modulated to lines of devotional passion. The lip shapes that had meant seductiveness were now made to express supplication. The glow on the cheek that yesterday could be translated as riotousness was evangelized today into the splendour of pious rhetoric. Animalism had become fanaticism, paganism Paulinism. The bold, rolling eye that had flashed upon her form in the old time with such mastery now beamed with the rude energy of a theolatry that was almost ferocious. Those black angularities which his face had used to put on when his wishes were thwarted now did duty in picturing the incorrigible backslider who would insist upon turning again to his wallowing in the mire. The lineaments, as such, seemed to complain. They had been diverted from their hereditary connotation to signify impressions for which nature did not intend them. Strange that their elevation was a misapplication, that to raise seemed to falsify. Yet could it be so? She would admit the ungenerous sentiment no longer. D'Urberville was not the first wicked man who had turned away from his wickedness to save his soul alive, and why should she deem it unnatural in him? It was but the usage of thought which had been jarred in her at hearing good new words in bad old notes. The greater the sinner, the greater the saint. It was not necessary to dive far into Christian history to discover that. Such impressions as these moved her vaguely and without strict definiteness. As soon as the nerveless pause of her surprise would allow her to stir, her impulse was to pass on, out of his sight. He had obviously not discerned her yet in her position against the sun, but the moment that she moved again he recognized her. The effect upon her old lover was electric, far stronger than the effect of his presence upon her. His fire, the tumultuous ring of his eloquence, seemed to go out of him. His lips struggled and trembled under the words that lay upon it, but deliver them it could not as long as she faced him. His eyes, after their first glance upon her face, hung confusedly in every other direction but hers, but came back in a desperate leap every few seconds. This paralysis lasted, however, but a short time, for Tess's energies returned with the atrophy of his, and she walked as fast as she was able past the barn and onward. As soon as she could reflect, it appalled her, this change in their relative platforms. He who had wrought her undoing was now on the side of the spirit, while she remained unregenerate, and, as in the legend, it had resulted that her Cyprian image had suddenly appeared upon his altar, whereby the fire of the priest had been well nigh extinguished. She went on without turning her head. Her back seemed to be endowed with a sensitiveness to ocular beams, even her clothing, so alive was she to a fancied gaze which might be resting upon her from the outside of that barn. All the way along to this point her heart had been heavy with an inactive sorrow. Now there was a change in the quality of its trouble. That hunger for affection too long withheld was for the time displaced by an almost physical sense of an implacable past which still engirdled her. It intensified her consciousness of error to a practical despair. The break of continuity between her earlier and present existence, which she had hoped for, had not, after all, taken place. Bygones would never be complete bygones till she was a bygone herself. Thus absorbed, she recrossed the northern part of Long Ash Lane at right angles, and presently saw before her the road ascending whitely to the upland, along whose margin the remainder of her journey lay. Its dry, pale surface stretched severely onward, unbroken by a single figure, vehicle, or mark, save some occasional brown horse droppings which dotted its cold aridity here and there. Whilst slowly breasting this ascent, Tess became conscious of footsteps behind her, and turning she saw approaching that well-known form, so strangely accoutred as the Methodist, the one personage in all the world she wished not to encounter alone on this side of the grave. There was not much time, however, for thought or illusion, and she yielded as calmly as she could to the necessity of letting him overtake her. She saw that he was excited less by the speed of his walk than by the feelings within him. "Tess," he said. She slackened speed without looking around. "Tess," he repeated. "It is I, Alec d'Urberville." She then looked back at him, and he came up. "I see it is," she answered coldly. "Well, is that all? Yet I deserve no more. Of course," he added with a slight laugh, "there is something of the ridiculous to your eyes in seeing me like this, but I must put up with that. I heard you had gone away. Nobody knew where. Tess, you wonder why I have followed you?" "I do rather, and I would that you had not, with all my heart." "Yes, you may well say it," he returned grimly, as they moved onward together, she with unwilling tread. "But don't mistake me. I beg this because you may have been led to do so in noticing, if you did notice it, how your sudden appearance unnerved me down there. It was but a momentary faltering, and considering what you have been to me, it was natural enough. But Will helped me through it, though perhaps you think me a humbug for saying it, and immediately afterwards I felt that of all the persons in the world whom it was my duty and desire to save from the wrath to come, sneer if you like, the woman whom I had so grievously wronged was that person. I have come with that sole purpose in view, nothing more." There was the smallest vein of scorn in her words of rejoinder. "Have you saved yourself? Charity begins at home, they say." "I have done nothing," he said indifferently. "Heaven, as I have been telling my hearers, has done all. No amount of contempt that you can pour upon me, Tess, will equal what I have poured upon myself, the old Adam of my former years. Well, it is a strange story, believe it or not, but I can tell you the means by which my conversion was brought about, and I hope you will be interested enough at least to listen. Have you ever heard the name of the parson of Emminster? You must have done so. Old Mr. Clare, one of the most earnest of his school, one of the few intense men left in the church. Not so intense as the extreme wing of Christian believers with which I have thrown in my lot, but quite an exception among the established clergy, the younger of whom are gradually attenuating the true doctrines by their sophistries, till they are but a shadow of what they were. I only differ from him on the question of church and state, the interpretation of the text, 'Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord.' That's all. He is one who, I firmly believe, has been the humble means of saving more souls in this country than any other man you can name. You have heard of him?" "I have," she said. "He came to Trantridge 2 or 3 years ago to preach on behalf of some missionary society, and I, wretched fellow that I was, insulted him when, in his disinterestedness, he tried to reason with me and show me the way. He did not resent my conduct. He simply said that some day I should receive the first fruits of the Spirit, and that those who came to scoff sometimes remained to pray. But there was a strange magic in his words. They sank into my mind. But the loss of my mother hit me most, and by degrees I was brought to see the daylight. Since then my one desire has been to hand on the true view to others, and that is what I was trying to do today, though it is only lately that I preached hereabout. The first months of my ministry have been spent in the north of England among strangers, where I preferred to make my earliest clumsy attempts so as to acquire courage before undergoing that severest of all tests of one's sincerity, addressing those who have known one and have been one's companions in the days of darkness. If you could only know, Tess, the pleasure of having a good slap at yourself, I'm sure— "Don't go on with it!" she cried passionately, as she turned away from him to a stile by the wayside, on which she bent herself. "I can't believe in such sudden things. I feel indignant with you for talking to me like this, when you know what harm you've done me. You and those like you take your fill of pleasure on earth by making the life of such as me bitter and black with sorrow, and then it's a fine thing when you have had enough of that to think of securing your pleasure in heaven by becoming converted. Out upon such I don't believe in you. I hate it." "Tess," he insisted, "don't speak so. It came to me like a jolly new idea, and you don't believe me. What don't you believe?" "Your conversion, your scheme of religion." "Why?" She dropped her voice. "Because a better man than you does not believe in such." "What a woman's reason! Who is this better man?" "I cannot tell you." "Well," he declared, a resentment beneath his words seeming ready to spring out at a moment's notice, "God forbid that I should say that I am a good man, and you know I don't say any such thing. I am new to goodness, truly, but newcomers see furthest sometimes." "Yes," she replied sadly, "but I cannot believe in your conversion to a new spirit. Such flashes as you feel, Alec, I fear don't last." Thus speaking, she turned from the stile over which she had been leaning and faced him, whereupon his eyes, falling casually upon the familiar countenance and form, remained contemplating her. The inferior man was quiet in him now, but it was surely not extracted, nor even entirely subdued. "Don't look at me like that," he said abruptly. Tess, who had been quite unconscious of her action and mien, instantly withdrew the large dark gaze of her eyes, stammering with a flush, "I beg your pardon," and there was revived in her wretched sentiment come to her before, that in inhabiting the fleshly tabernacle with which nature had endowed her, she was somehow doing wrong. "No, no, don't beg my pardon. But since you wear a veil to hide your good looks, why don't you keep it down?" She pulled down the veil, saying hastily, "It was mostly to keep off the wind." "It may seem harsh of me to dictate like this," he went on, "but it is better that I should not look too often on you. It might be dangerous." "Shh!" said Tess. "Well, women's faces have had too much power over me already for me not to fear them. An evangelist has nothing to do with such as they, and it reminds me of the old times that I would forget." After this their conversation dwindled to a casual remark now and then as they rambled onward, Tess inwardly wondering how far he was going with her, and not liking to send him back by positive mandate. Frequently, when they came to a gate or stile, she found painted thereupon in red or blue letters some text of Scripture, and she asked him if he knew who had been at pains to emblazon these announcements. He told her that the man was employed by himself and others who were working with him in that district to paint these reminders, that no means might be left untried which might move the hearts of a wicked generation. At length the road touched the spot called Cross in Hand. Of all spots on the bleached and desolate upland, this was the most forlorn. It was so far removed from the charm which is sought in landscape by artists and view lovers as to reach a new kind of beauty, a negative beauty of tragic tone. The place took its name from a stone pillar which stood there, a strange rude monolith from a stratum unknown in any local quarry, on which was roughly carved a human hand. Differing accounts were given of its history and purport. Some authorities stated that a devotional cross had once formed the complete erection thereupon, of which the present relic was but the stump. Others that the stone as it stood was entire, and that it had been fixed there to mark a boundary or place of meeting. Anyhow, whatever the origin of the relic, there was and is something sinister or solemn, according to mood, in the scene amid which it stands, something tending to impress the most phlegmatic passer-by. "I think I must leave you now," he remarked as they drew near to this spot. "I have to preach at Abbott's Churnel at 6 this evening, and my way lies across to the right from here, and you upset me somewhat too, Tessie. I will not say why. I must go away and get strength." "How is it that you speak so fluently now? Who has taught you such good English?" "I have learnt things in my troubles," she said evasively. "What troubles have you had?" She told him of the first one, the only one that related to him. D'Urberville was struck mute. "I knew nothing of this till now," he next murmured. "Why didn't you write to me when you felt your trouble coming on?" She did not reply, and he broke the silence by adding, "Well, you will see me again?" "No," she answered. "Do not again come near me." "I will think. But before we part, come here." He stepped up to the pillar. "This was once a holy cross. Relics are not in my creed, but I fear you at moments, far more than you need fear me at present, and to lessen my fear, put your hand upon that stone hand, and swear that you will never tempt me by your charms or ways." "Good God! How can you ask what is so unnecessary? All that is furthest from my thought." "Yes, but swear it." Tess, half frightened, gave way to his importunity, placed her hand upon the stone, and swore. "I'm sorry you're not a believer," he continued, "that some unbeliever should have got hold of you and unsettled your mind. But no more now. At home, at least, I can pray for you, and I will, and who knows what may not happen? I'm off. Goodbye." He turned to a hunting gate in the hedge, and, without letting his eyes rest upon her, leapt over and struck out across the down in the direction of Abbott's Churnel. As he walked, his pace showed perturbation, and by, as if instigated by a former thought, he drew from his pocket a small book, between the leaves of which was folded a letter, worn and soiled, as from much rereading. D'Urberville opened the letter. It was dated several months before this time, and was signed by Parson Clare. The letter began by expressing the writer's unfeigned joy at d'Urberville's conversion, and thanked him for his kindness in communicating with the parson on the subject. It expressed Mr. Clare's warm assurance of forgiveness for d'Urberville's former conduct, and his interest in the young man's plans for the future. He, Mr. Clare, would very much have liked to see d'Urberville in the church to whose ministry he had devoted so many years of his own life, and would have helped him to enter a theological college to that end. But since his correspondent had possibly not cared to do this on account of the delay it would have entailed, he was not the man to insist upon its paramount importance. Every man must work as he could best work, and in the method towards which he felt impelled by the Spirit. D'Urberville read and reread this letter, and seemed to quiz himself cynically. He had also read some passages from memoranda as he walked, till his face assumed a calm, and apparently the image of Tess no longer troubled his mind. She, meanwhile, had kept along the edge of the hill by which lay her nearest way home. Within the distance of a mile she met a solitary shepherd. "What is the meaning of that old stone I have passed?" she asked of him. "Was it ever a holy cross?"
"Cross? No, 'twere not a cross. 'Tis a thing of ill omen, miss. It were put up in world times by the relations of a malefactor who was tortured there by nailing his hand to a post, and afterwards hung. The bones lie underneath. They say he sold his soul to the devil, and that he walks at times." She felt the petite mort at this unexpectedly gruesome information, and left the solitary man behind her. It was dusk when she drew near to Flintcomb Ash, and in the lane at the entrance to the hamlet she approached a girl and her lover without their observing her. They were talking no secrets, and the clear, unconcerned voice of the young woman, in response to the warmer accents of the man, spread to the chilly air as one soothing thing within the dusky horizon, full of a stagnant obscurity upon which nothing else intruded. For a moment the voices cheered the heart of Tess, till she reasoned that this interview had its origin, on one side or the other, in the same attraction which had been the prelude to her own tribulation. When she came close, the girl turned serenely and recognized her, the young man walking off in embarrassment. The woman was Izz Hewitt, whose interest in Tess's excursion immediately superseded her own proceedings. Tess did not explain very clearly its results, and Izz, who was a girl of tact, began to speak of her own little affair, a phase of which Tess had just witnessed. "He is Amby Seedling, a chap who used to sometimes come and help at Talbothays," she explained indifferently. "He actually inquired and found out I had come here, and has followed me. He says he's been in love with me these 2 years, but I have hardly answered him." End of chapter 45. Chapter 46. Several days had passed since her futile journey, and Tess was afield. The dry winter wind still blew, but a screen of thatched hurdles erected in the eye of the blast kept its force away from her. On the sheltered side was a turnip-slicing machine, whose bright blue hue of new paint seemed almost vocal in the otherwise subdued scene. Opposite its front was a long mound or grave, in which the roots had been preserved since early winter. Tess was standing at the uncovered end, chopping off with a billhook the fibres and earth from each root, and throwing it after the operation into the slicer. A man was turning the handle of the machine, and from its trough came the newly cut swedes, the fresh smell of whose yellow chips was accompanied by the sounds of the snuffling wind, the smart swish of the slicing blades, and the choppings of the hook in Tess's leather-gloved hand. The wide acreage of blank agricultural brownness, apparent where the swedes had been pulled, was beginning to be striped in wales of darker brown, gradually broadening to ribbons. Along the edge of each of these something crept upon 10 legs, moving without haste and without rest up and down the whole length of the field. It was 2 horses and a man, the plough going between them, turning up the cleared ground for a spring sowing. For hours nothing relieved the joyless monotony of things. Then, far beyond the ploughing teams, a black speck was seen. It had come from the corner of a fence where there was a gap, and its tendency was up the incline towards the swede cutters. From the proportions of a mere point it advanced to the shape of a 9-pin, and was soon perceived to be a man in black, arriving from the direction of Flintcomb Ash.
The man at the slicer, having nothing else to do with his eyes, continually observed the comer, but Tess, who was occupied, did not perceive him till her companion directed her attention to his approach. It was not her hard taskmaster, Farmer Groby. It was one in a semi-clerical costume, who now represented what had once been the free and easy Alec d'Urberville. Not being hot at his preaching, there was less enthusiasm about him now, and the presence of the grinder seemed to embarrass him. A pale distress was already on Tess's face, and she pulled her curtained hood further over it. D'Urberville came up and said quietly, "I want to speak to you, Tess." "You have refused my last request not to come near me," said she. "Yes, but I have a good reason." "Well, tell it." "It is more serious than you may think." He glanced round to see if he were overheard. They were at some distance from the man who turned the slicer, and the movement of the machine too sufficiently prevented Alec's words reaching other ears. D'Urberville placed himself so as to screen Tess from the labourer, turning his back to the latter. "It is this," he continued with capricious compunction. "In thinking of your soul and mine when we last met, I neglected to inquire as to your worldly condition. You were well dressed, and I did not think of it. But I see now that it is hard, harder than it used to be when I knew you, harder than you deserve. Perhaps a good deal of it is owing to me." She did not answer, and he watched her inquiringly as, with bent head, her face completely screened by the hood, she resumed her trimming of the swedes. By going on with her work she felt better able to keep him outside her emotions. "Tess," he added with a sigh of discontent, "yours was the very worst case I was ever concerned in. I had no idea of what had resulted till you told me. Scamp that I was to foul that innocent life! The whole blame was mine, the whole unconventional business of our time at Trantridge. You, too, the real blood of which I am but a base imitation, what a blind young thing you were as to possibilities! I say in all earnestness that it is a shame for parents to bring up their girls in such dangerous ignorance of the gins and nets that the wicked may set for them, whether their motive be a good one or the result of simple indifference." Tess still did no more than listen, throwing down one globular root and taking up another with automatic regularity, the pensive contour of the mere field woman alone marking her. "But it is not that I came to say," d'Urberville went on. "My circumstances are these. I have lost my mother since you were at Trantridge, and the place is my own, but I intend to sell it and devote myself to missionary work in Africa. A devil of a poor hand I shall make at the trade, no doubt. However, what I want to ask you is, will you put it in my power to do my duty, to make the only reparation I can make for the trick I played you? That is, will you be my wife and go with me? I have already obtained this precious document. It was my old mother's dying wish." He drew a piece of parchment from his pocket with a slight fumbling of embarrassment. "What is it?" said she. "A marriage licence." "Oh no, sir, no," she said quickly, starting back. "You will not? Why is that?" As he asked the question, a disappointment which was not entirely the disappointment of thwarted duty crossed d'Urberville's face. It was unmistakably a symptom that something of his old passion for her had been revived. Duty and desire ran hand in hand. "Surely," he began again in more impetuous tones, and then looked round at the labourer who turned the slicer. Tess, too, felt that the argument could not be ended there. Informing the man that a gentleman had come to see her, with whom she wished to walk a little way, she moved off with d'Urberville across the zebra-striped field. When they reached the first newly ploughed section, he held out his hand to help her over it, and she stepped forward on the summits of the earth rolls as if she did not see him. "You will not marry me, Tess, and make me a self-respecting man?" he repeated, as soon as they were over the furrows.
"I cannot."
"But why?"
"You know I have no affection for you."
"But you would get to feel that in time, perhaps, as soon as you really could forgive me?"
"Never."
"Why so positive?"
"I love somebody else."
The words seemed to astonish him.
"You do?" he cried. "Somebody else?
But has not a sense of what is morally right and proper any weight with you?"
"No, no, no, don't say that."
"Anyhow, then, your love for this other man may only be a passing feeling which you will overcome."
"No, no."
"Yes, yes, why not?"
"I cannot tell you."
"You must, in honour."
"Well then, I have married him."
"Ah!" he exclaimed, and he stopped dead and gazed at her.
"I did not wish to tell. I did not mean to," she pleaded. "It is a secret here, or at any rate but dimly known. So will you, please, will you keep from questioning me? You must remember that we are now strangers."
"Strangers, are we? Strangers?" For a moment a flash of his old irony marked his face, but he determinedly chastened it down. "Is that man your husband?" he asked mechanically, denoting by a sign the labourer who turned the machine.
"That man?" she said proudly. "I should think not."
"Who then?"
"Do not ask what I do not wish to tell," she begged, and flashed her appeal to him from her upturned face and lash-shadowed eyes.
D'Urberville was disturbed.
"But I only asked for your sake," he retorted hotly. "Angels of heaven, God forgive me for such an expression! I came here, I swear, as I thought for your good. Tess, don't look at me so. I cannot stand your looks. There never were such eyes, surely, before Christianity or since. There, I won't lose my head. I dare not. I own that the sight of you had wakened up my love for you, which I believed was extinguished with all such feelings. But I thought that our marriage might be a sanctification for us both. The unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, I said to myself. But my plan is dashed from me, and I must bear the disappointment."
He moodily reflected with his eyes on the ground.
"Married, married!
Well, that being so," he added quite calmly, tearing the licence slowly into halves and putting them in his pocket, "that being prevented, I should like to do some good for you and your husband, whoever he may be. There are many questions that I am tempted to ask, but I will not do so, of course, in opposition to your wishes. Though, if I could know your husband, I might more easily benefit him and you. Is he on this farm?"
"No," she murmured. "He is far away."
"Far away? From you? What sort of a husband can he be?"
"Oh, do not speak against him. It was through you he found out."
"Ah, it is so. That's sad, Tess."
"Yes. But to stay away from you, to leave you to work like this—"
"He does not leave me to work," she cried, springing to the defence of the absent one with all her fervour.
"He don't know it. It is by my own arrangement."
"Then does he write?"
I cannot tell you. There are things which are private to ourselves."
"Of course that means that he does not. You are a deserted wife, my fair Tess." In an impulse he turned suddenly to take her hand. The buff glove was on it, and he seized only the rough leather fingers which did not express the life or shape of those within.
"You must not, you must not!"
she cried fearfully, slipping her hand from the glove as from a pocket and leaving it in his grasp.
"Oh, will you go away, for the sake of me and my husband? Go in the name of your own Christianity."
Yes, yes, I will," he said abruptly, and thrusting the glove back to her he turned to leave. Facing round, however, he said, "Tess, as God is my judge, I meant no humbug in taking your hand." A pattering of hoofs on the soil of the field, which they had not noticed in their preoccupation, ceased close behind them, and a voice reached her ear.
"What the devil are you doing away from your work at this time of day?"
Farmer Groby had espied the two figures from the distance, and had inquisitively ridden across to learn what was their business in his field.
"Don't speak like that to her,"
said d'Urberville, his face blackening with something that was not Christianity.
"Indeed, mister, and what mid-Methodist parsons have to do with she?"
"Who is the fellow?" asked d'Urberville, turning to Tess. She went close up to him. "Go, I do beg you," she said.
"What, and leave you to that tyrant? I can see in his face what a churl he is."
"He won't hurt me. He's not in love with me. I can leave at Lady Day."
"Well, I have no right to obey, I suppose, but, well, goodbye."
Her defender, whom she dreaded more than her assailant, having reluctantly disappeared, the farmer continued his reprimand, which Tess took with the greatest coolness, that sort of attack being independent of sex. To have as a master this man of stone, who would have cuffed her if he had dared, was almost a relief after her former experiences. She silently walked back towards the summit of the field that was the scene of her labour, so absorbed in the interview which had just taken place that she was hardly aware that the nose of Groby's horse almost touched her shoulders.
"If so be you make an arrangement to work for me till Lady Day, I'll see you carry it out," he growled. "Od rot the women! Now 'tis one thing, and then 'tis the other. But I'll put up with it no longer."
Knowing very well that he did not harass the other women of the farm as he harassed her out of spite for the flooring he had once received, she did for one moment picture what might have been the result if she had been free to accept the offer just made of her, of being the moneyed Alec's wife. It would have lifted her completely out of subjection, not only to her present oppressive employer, but to a whole world who seemed to despise her. "But no, no," she said breathlessly. "I could not have married him now. He is so unpleasant to me." That very night she began an appealing letter to Clare, concealing from him her hardships and assuring him of her undying affection. Anyone who had been in a position to read between the lines would have seen that at the back of her great love was some monstrous fear, almost a desperation, as to some secret contingencies which were not disclosed. But again she did not finish her effusion. He had asked Izz to go with him, and perhaps he did not care for her at all. She put the letter in her box, and wondered if it would ever reach Angel's hands. After this her daily tasks were gone through heavily enough, and brought on the day which was of great import to agriculturalists, the day of the Candlemas Fair. It was at this fair that new engagements were entered into for the 12 months following the ensuing Lady Day, and those of the farming population who thought of changing their places duly attended at the county town where the fair was held. Nearly all the labourers at Flint Camash Farm intended flight, and early in the morning there was a general exodus in the direction of the town, which lay at a distance of from 10 to a dozen miles over hilly country. Though Tess also meant to leave at the quarter-day, she was one of the few who did not go to the fair, having a vaguely shaped hope that something would happen to render another outdoor engagement unnecessary. It was a peaceful February day, of wonderful softness for the time, and one would almost have thought that winter was over. She had hardly finished her dinner when d'Urberville's figure darkened the window of the cottage wherein she was a lodger, which she had all to herself today. Tess jumped up, but her visitor had knocked at the door, and she could hardly in reason run away. D'Urberville's knock, his walk up to the door, had some indescribable quality of difference from his air when she last saw him. They seemed to be acts of which the doer was ashamed. She thought that she would not open the door, but as there was no sense in that either, she arose, and having lifted the latch, stepped back quickly. He came in, saw her, and flung himself down to a chair before speaking. "Tess, I couldn't help it," he began desperately as he wiped his heated face, which had also a superimposed flush of excitement. "I felt that I must call at least to ask how you are. I assure you that I have not been thinking of you at all till I saw you that Sunday. Now I cannot get rid of your image, try how I may. It is hard that a good woman should do harm to a bad man, yet so it is. If you would only pray for me, Tess." The suppressed discontent of his manner was almost pitiable, and yet Tess did not pity him. "How can I pray for you," she said, "when I am forbidden to believe that the great power who moves the world will alter his plans on my account?" "You really think that?" "Yes, I have been cured of the presumption of thinking otherwise." "Cured? By whom?" "By my husband, if I must tell." "Ah, your husband, your husband. How strange it seems. I remember you hinted something of the sort the other day." "What do you really believe in these matters, Tess?" he asked. "You seem to have no religion, perhaps owing to me." "But I have, though I don't believe in anything supernatural." D'Urberville looked at her with misgiving. "Then do you think that the line I take is all wrong?" "A good deal of it." And yet I felt so sure about it," he said uneasily. "I believe in the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount, and so did my dear husband, but I don't believe—" Here she gave her negations. "The fact is," said d'Urberville dryly, "whatever your dear husband believed you accept, and whatever he rejected you'll reject, without the least inquiry or reasoning on your own part. It's just like you women, your mind is enslaved to his." "Ah, because he knew everything," said she, with a triumphant simplicity of faith in Angel Clare that the most perfect man could hardly have deserved, much less her husband. "Yes, but you should not take negative opinions wholesale from another person like that. A pretty fellow he must be to teach you such scepticism." "He never forced my judgment. He would never argue on the subject with me. But I looked at it in this way. What he believed, after inquiring deep into doctrines, was much more likely to be right than what I might believe, who hadn't looked into doctrines at all." "What used he to say? He must have said something." She reflected, and with her accurate memory for the letter of Angel Clare's remarks, even when she did not comprehend their spirit, she recalled a merciless polemical syllogism that she had heard him use when, as it occasionally happened, he indulged in a species of thinking aloud with her at his side. In delivering it she also gave Clare's accent and manner with reverential faithfulness. "Say that again," asked d'Urberville, who had listened with the greatest attention. She repeated the argument, and d'Urberville thoughtfully murmured the words after her. "Anything else?" he presently asked. "He said at another time something like this," and she gave another, which might possibly have been paralleled in many a work of the pedigree, ranging from the Dictionnaire Philosophique to Huxley's Essays. "Aha! How do you remember them?" "I wanted to believe what he believed, though he didn't wish me to, and I managed to coax him to tell me a few of his thoughts. I can't say I quite understood that one, but I know it is right." Fancy your being able to teach me what you don't know yourself." He fell into thought. "And so I threw in my spiritual lot with his," she resumed. "I didn't wish to be different. What's good enough for him is good enough for me." "Does he know that you are as big an infidel as he?" "No, I never told him, if I am an infidel." "Well, you are better off today than I am, Tess, after all. You don't believe that you ought to preach my doctrine, and therefore do not despise to your conscience in abstaining. I do believe I ought to preach it, but, like the devils, I believe and tremble, for I suddenly leave off preaching it, and give way to my passion for you." "How?" "Why," he said aridly, "I have come all the way here to see you today, but I started from home to go to the Casterbridge Fair, where I have undertaken to preach the word from a waggon at 2:30 this afternoon, and where all the brethren are expecting me this minute. Here's the announcement." He drew from his breast pocket a poster whereupon was printed the day, hour, and place of meeting, at which he, d'Urberville, would preach the gospel as aforesaid. "But how can you get there?" said Tess, looking at the clock. "I cannot get there. I have come here." "What? You've really arranged to preach, and—" "I have arranged to preach, and I shall not be there, by reason of my burning desire to see a woman whom I once despised. No, by my word and truth, I never despised you. If I had, I should not love you now. Why I did not despise you was on account of your being unsmirched in spite of all. You withdrew yourself from me so quickly and resolutely when you saw the situation. You did not remain at my pleasure. So there was one petticoat in the world for whom I had no contempt, and you are she. But you may well despise me now. I thought I worshipped on the mountains, but I find I still serve in the groves. Ha ha!" "Oh, Alec d'Urberville, what does this mean? What have I done?" "Done?" he said, with a soulless sneer in the word. "Nothing intentionally, but you have been the means, the innocent means of my backsliding, as they call it. I ask myself, am I indeed one of those servants of corruption who, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, are again entangled therein and overcome, whose latter end is worse than their beginning?" He laid his hand on her shoulder. "Tess, my girl, I was on the way to at least social salvation till I saw you again," he said, freakishly shaking her as if she were a child. "And why then have you tempted me? I was firm as a man could be till I saw those eyes and that mouth again. Surely there never was such a maddening mouth since Eve's." His voice sank, and a hot archness shot from his own black eyes. "You temptress, Tess, you dear damned witch of Babylon, I could not resist you as soon as I met you again." "I could not help your seeing me again," said Tess, recoiling. "I know it. I repeat that I do not blame you. But the fact remains. When I saw you ill-used on the farm that day, I was nearly mad to think that I had no legal right to protect you, that I could not have it, whilst he who has it seems to neglect you utterly." "Don't speak against him. He is absent," she cried in much excitement. "Treat him honourably. He has never wronged you. Oh, leave his wife before any scandal spreads that may do harm to his honest name." I will," he said, like a man awakening from a luring dream. "I have broken my engagement to preach to those poor drunken boobies at the fair. It is the first time I have played such a practical joke. A month ago I should have been horrified at such a possibility. I'll go away to swear, and, can I, to keep away." Then suddenly, "One clasp, Tessie, one, only for old friendship." "I am without defence, Alec. A good man's honour is in my keeping. Think, be ashamed." "Pooh! Well, yes." He clenched his lips, mortified with himself for his weakness. His eyes were equally barren of worldly and religious faith. The corpses of those old fitful passions which had lain inanimate amid the lines of his face ever since his reformation seemed to wake and come together as in a resurrection. He went out indeterminately. Though d'Urberville had declared that this breach of his engagement today was the simple backsliding of a believer, Tess's words, as echoed from Angel Clare, had made a deep impression upon him, and continued to do so after he had left her. He moved on in silence, as if his energies were benumbed by the hitherto undreamt of possibility that his position was untenable. Reason had had nothing to do with his whimsical conversion, which was perhaps the mere freak of a careless man in search of a new sensation, and temporarily impressed by his mother's death. The drops of logic Tess had let fall into the sea of his enthusiasm served to chill its effervescence to stagnation. He said to himself, as he pondered again and again over the crystallized phrases that she had handed on to him, "That clever fellow little thought that, by telling her those things, he might be paving my way back to her." End of chapter 46.